Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The howl that pierced the night wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It sent chills down my spine and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In my 15 years as a forest ranger, I'd encountered all sorts of wildlife, but this was different. My name's John, and I've spent most of my adult life patrolling these woods. I thought I knew every inch of this forest, every creature that called it home. But that night, everything I thought I knew was turned upside down. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath fogs in front of you and the leaves crunch underfoot. I was doing my usual night rounds, flashlight in hand, scanning the trails for any signs of trouble. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow through the canopy of trees. That's when I heard it, that bone-chilling howl. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was wolf, but we hadn't had wolves in these parts for decades. Besides, this sound was bigger somehow, more primal. I radioed back to base, keeping my voice low. "This is John. I'm hearing some strange animal calls out here, going to investigate." The radio crackled with static before a response came through. "Copy that, John. Be careful out there." I switched off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. Years in the forest had taught me to trust my other senses. The night was eerily quiet now, as if all the usual forest creatures were holding their breath. I moved slowly, carefully placing each foot to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves, my ears strained for any sound, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The moonlight created strange shapes in the darkness, and more than once I found myself jumping at what turned out to be nothing more than an oddly shaped branch. As I crept forward, a strong, musky odor hit me. It was unlike anything I'd smelled before, not quite animal, not quite human. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to gag. That's when I saw them, the tracks. My blood ran cold as I crouched down to examine them. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with clear impressions of claws at the end of each toe. But what really got me was the shape. They were almost human-like, but elongated and distorted. I'd seen plenty of bear tracks in my time, but these were something else entirely. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it be some kind of mutated bear, a hoax, or something else? I took out my phone, snapping a few quick photos of the prints. My hands were shaking so badly I had to take each shot twice to get a clear image. Just as I was about to stand up, I heard it. A sharp crack, like a twig snapping under a heavy weight. It came from behind me, no more than 20 feet away. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but years of training kept me rooted to the spot. Slowly, ever so slowly, I turned around, my hand inching towards the bear spray on my belt. What I saw in that moment will stay with me for the rest of my life. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet if not more, and it was covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. But it was the eyes that really got me. They glowed in the darkness, 2 pinpricks of amber that seemed to stare right through me. There was an intelligence there, a consciousness that was unmistakably non-animal. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was blank, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, as if sensing my paralysis, the creature took a step forward. The movement snapped me out of my trance, and pure primal fear took over. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I kept going. I could hear it behind me, the heavy footfalls and the sound of vegetation being pushed aside. It was following me, and it was fast. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that frantic flight through the dark forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear kept me going. Finally, mercifully, I saw the lights of the ranger station through the trees. I burst into the clearing, gasping for air, my uniform torn and dirty. My colleague, Mike, was just coming out of the station. His eyes widened as he took in my disheveled appearance. "John, what the hell happened to you?" I tried to speak, but no words would come. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? Mike guided me inside, sat me down, and pressed a cup of hot coffee into my trembling hands. "Take it easy, buddy. Deep breaths. Now tell me what happened out there." Slowly, haltingly, I recounted my experience, the howl, the tracks, the creature. As I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into Mike's eyes. I didn't blame him. If our roles were reversed, I'm not sure I would have believed it either. When I finished, Mike was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Look, John, you've been working hard lately. Maybe the stress is getting to you. Why don't you take a few days off?" I wanted to argue, to make him understand that this was real, but exhaustion was setting in. I just nodded, too tired to fight. The next day, I went back out to the spot where I'd seen the tracks, this time in broad daylight and with Mike in tow. But there was nothing there. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything unusual had happened the night before. Mike clapped me on the shoulder. "See? Probably just a bear and your imagination running wild. It happens to the best of us." I nodded, but I knew what I'd seen. The image of those glowing eyes was burned into my memory. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I pored over cryptozoology websites, read accounts of Bigfoot sightings, and even reached out to a few experts in the field. Most dismissed my story outright, but a few seemed genuinely interested. I started carrying a camera with me on all my patrols, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. I set up trail cams in the area where I'd had my encounter. Night after night I'd go out, retracing my steps, searching for any sign of the beast. But there was nothing. No more howls, no more tracks, no more sightings. It was as if that night had never happened. Doubt began to creep in. Had it all been in my head? Was Mike right about the stress getting to me? But every time I started to question my sanity, I'd remember those eyes, that unmistakable intelligence, and I knew it had been real. My obsession started to affect my work. I became distracted, jumpy. My colleagues noticed, exchanging worried glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I overheard whispers about PTSD, about me losing it. Finally, after months of fruitless searching, I had to face facts. Whatever I'd seen that night, it didn't want to be found, and my pursuit of it was destroying my life and my career. I made a decision. I packed away my research, deleted the fruitless hours of trail cam footage, and tried to put it all behind me. I focused on my job, on the tangible, explainable parts of forest management. But late at night, when the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows grow long, I still find myself listening for that otherworldly howl, for the sound of heavy footsteps in the underbrush. Because I know it's out there, somewhere in the depths of the forest. And a part of me, the part that will always be that awestruck ranger, staring into intelligent amber eyes, hopes that someday, somehow, our paths will cross again. Until then, I'll keep watch over these woods, protecting not just the known creatures that call this forest home, but also the mysteries that lurk in its shadows. Because that night taught me an important lesson. There are some things in this world that defy explanation, some wonders that can't be catalogued or contained, and sometimes the greatest adventure is simply knowing they exist. Story 2. The forest had never felt so oppressive. As I stood there, staring at the massive footprint sunk deep into the mud, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew about these woods was about to change. My name's Mike, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. It started like any other day. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as I made my rounds. I'd gotten a call from some campers about strange noises the night before, so I decided to swing by their site to check things out. As I approached the campground, I noticed something was off. The usual chatter of birds was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The campers were packing up in a hurry, their faces pale and drawn. "What's going on, folks?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light despite the tension in the air. A man in his 40s, who introduced himself as Tom, approached me. His hands were shaking slightly as he spoke. "Ranger, we heard something last night. It was big, whatever it was, circling our camp, making these awful grunting noises. We thought it might be a bear, but—" He trailed off, glancing nervously at the tree line. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "But what?" I prompted. Tom's wife chimed in, her voice barely above a whisper. "It walked on 2 legs, Ranger. We heard it. And this morning we found, well, you should see for yourself." They led me to the edge of their campsite, where a set of tracks led into the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt to examine them. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, with a shape that was disturbingly human-like. I've tracked all kinds of wildlife in these parts, bears, mountain lions, you name it. But these were something else entirely. The stride length alone suggested whatever made them stood well over 7 feet tall. "Did you see what made these?" I asked, already knowing the answer. The campers shook their heads. "It was too dark," Tom said, "but we heard it. God, the sounds it made." I reassured them as best I could, helped them finish packing, and saw them off. But as their car disappeared down the road, leaving me alone with those tracks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the tracks. They led deeper into the forest, away from the established trails. As I walked, the canopy grew thicker, blocking out more and more sunlight until I was moving through a world of shifting shadows. The tracks continued for nearly a mile before suddenly vanishing at the base of a massive oak tree. I circled the area, searching for any sign of where the creature might have gone, but it was like it had simply disappeared into thin air. As the day wore on, I found myself returning to that spot again and again. I took photos, measurements, even made plaster casts of the prints. But the more evidence I gathered, the less sense it all made. Night fell faster than I expected, the forest plunging into darkness around me. I knew I should head back, but something kept me there, searching. That's when I heard it, a sound that turned my blood to ice. It started as a low rumble, almost too deep to hear. Then it rose into a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. Crack! A branch snapped somewhere to my left. I whirled toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. For a split second I saw something, a massive shape, easily 8 feet tall, moving with surprising grace between the trees. Then it was gone, swallowed by the night. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I chased after it to get a better look. But the truth is, I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I replayed the night's events in my mind. What had I seen? A bear standing on its hind legs? Some kind of undiscovered primate? Or was it simply my imagination, fueled by the camper's story and those impossible tracks? I spent the next week combing through every inch of that forest. I set up trail cameras, collected hair samples, and interviewed every camper and hiker I could find. But the evidence remained frustratingly inconclusive. The photos from my trail cams showed nothing but normal wildlife. The hair samples turned out to be from a black bear. And while a few hikers reported hearing strange noises at night, no one else had seen the creature. As the days passed, I began to doubt my own experience. Had I really seen something that night, or had the shadows and my own expectations played tricks on me? I found myself obsessively reviewing the photos of those footprints, the only tangible evidence that something unusual had occurred. It was on one of these late nights, as I pored over my notes for the 100th time, that I heard a knock at my cabin door. Confused, it was well past midnight and I wasn't expecting anyone, I cautiously approached the entrance. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer came, just another soft knock. Swallowing hard, I opened the door and found myself face to face with Tom, the camper from that first night. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, Ranger Mike," he said, his face haggard and drawn. "But I had to come back. I had to know. Did you find anything?" I invited him in, fixing us both a strong cup of coffee as I filled him in on my fruitless investigation. As I spoke, I could see the disappointment growing in his eyes. "So that's it then?" he asked when I finished. "We just forget it ever happened?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know, Tom. I can't explain what we experienced, but I also can't prove anything out of the ordinary occurred. Sometimes, in the woods at night." "No," he cut me off, his voice firm. "I know what I heard, what we both saw. It was real, Ranger, and it's still out there." We talked for hours, going over every detail of that night. As the first light of dawn began to creep through my windows, Tom stood to leave. "I'm going back out there," he announced. "I need to know the truth." I tried to talk him out of it, but I could see the determination in his eyes. In the end, I agreed to accompany him on one last expedition into the heart of the forest. We set out at first light, armed with cameras, audio recorders, and enough supplies for a 3-day trek. As we hiked deeper into the woods, retracing my steps from that fateful night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something we weren't prepared for. On the second day, we found fresh tracks, the same massive human-like prints I'd seen before. We followed them, our excitement growing with each step. The trail led us to a small clearing where we made a discovery that chilled me to the bone. There, in the soft earth, was a perfect impression of a massive, humanoid form. It was as if something huge had lain down there, leaving an imprint of its body in the ground. Beside it, half buried in the dirt, was a clump of long, coarse hair. As we stood there, staring in disbelief at the evidence before us, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. We spun around, cameras at the ready, and for a brief moment I saw it again, that massive, shadowy figure moving through the trees. This time I didn't run. This time I raised my camera and snapped a photo. The image, when we reviewed it later, was blurry and indistinct. But there was no denying the shape captured in the frame. A tall, bipedal creature covered in dark fur, its features obscured but undeniably not human. That photo, along with the hair samples and plaster casts of the prints and body impression, now sit in a locked drawer in my office. I've submitted reports, reached out to wildlife experts and universities, but so far no one has been able to provide a satisfactory explanation for what Tom and I encountered in those woods. As I sit here, writing this account, I can hear the wind whistling through the trees outside my cabin, and sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear something else, a deep, rumbling growl that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the forest I call home. I don't know what's out there in the darkness of Blackwood National Forest, but I do know this. The next time I hear reports of strange noises or oversized tracks, I won't be so quick to dismiss them. Because sometimes the legends we grow up hearing have more truth to them than we'd like to admit. And sometimes the monsters in the woods are all too real. Story 3. The forest always had a way of swallowing sound, turning even the loudest noise into a muffled whisper. But tonight it was different. Tonight, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, suffocating. It felt like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something or someone. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me too. My name's Ethan. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I've spent most of my nights patrolling this part of the forest. I know these woods like the back of my hand, every trail, every bend in the river, every twisted branch of the pines that stretch toward the sky. But tonight, I felt like a stranger. It started with a call just after sunset. A hiker had reported strange noises, heavy footsteps, snapping branches, low growls. It wasn't the first time we'd gotten a report like that. People come out here, they get scared by an owl, or maybe a bear, and they call us in a panic. But something about this one felt different. The caller sounded genuinely terrified, and the way he described the sound, it didn't match anything I'd heard before. I shrugged it off, as much as I could. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and my gun, not that I expected to need it, and headed out to check the trail where the noises were heard. It was a popular path, one that wound through the denser part of the woods, thick with pine and birch. The kind of place where the light never fully breaks through the canopy, even on the brightest days. The moment I stepped onto the trail, that feeling of being watched crept over me. You know that prickling sensation, like eyes are on the back of your neck. That was it. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to nerves. Maybe the caller's anxiety had gotten into my head. Still, I found myself gripping my flashlight a little tighter than usual as I made my way deeper into the woods. The first mile of the trail was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest were there. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. But the deeper I went, the quieter it got. Soon, even the breeze seemed to die, and all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I stopped for a moment, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but more trees and shadows. I was about to move on when I saw it, a footprint. Huge, easily twice the size of my boot, pressed deep into the soft earth beside the trail. I crouched down, running my hand over the edge of the print. The weight of whatever made it had to be enormous. My first thought was a bear, maybe a grizzly, though they weren't common in this area. But as I looked closer, something didn't sit right. The shape wasn't right for a bear's paw. It looked human, a massive, distorted version of a human foot. My pulse quickened. I stood up, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. I radioed back to the station, reporting the footprint, but all I got was static. That didn't make sense. The radios worked fine out here. I tried again. Nothing. A knot of unease tightened in my gut, but I wasn't ready to turn back. Not yet. Whatever was out here, I needed to find it. I continued down the trail, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow shifting between the trees, a flicker of something large and dark. But whenever I turned my light toward it, there was nothing. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep I felt it in my chest. It came from somewhere ahead of me, just off the trail. My blood went cold. I froze, listening, straining to hear past the pounding of my own heart. Another growl, this one closer. I turned slowly, shining my light into the trees. The beams swept across the trunks, casting long, eerie shadows. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, reflecting the light of my flashlight. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they were fixed on me, unblinking. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, staring back at those eyes. They were maybe 30 feet away, hidden among the thick underbrush. I couldn't make out the shape of the creature, just those eyes, watching me, studying me. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. Whatever this thing was, I couldn't afford to turn my back on it. Slowly, I reached for my gun, never taking my eyes off those glowing orbs. My fingers fumbled with the holster, slick with sweat. I got the gun out and raised it, keeping it steady. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice rougher than I intended. "Get out of here!" The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart lurch, the creature stepped forward just enough for me to see the outline of its massive body. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, easily over 7 feet. Broad shoulders, thick limbs, and covered in dark, matted fur. It stood on 2 legs, but hunched forward slightly, as if ready to lunge. For a moment, neither of us moved. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could feel sweat dripping down the back of my neck, but I didn't dare wipe it away. Then, with a deep, rumbling growl, the creature took another step toward me. I fired. The gunshot echoed through the trees, deafening in the stillness of the forest. The creature let out a snarling, almost human scream, and in a blur of movement, it disappeared into the underbrush. I stood there, breathing hard, my gun still raised, my ears ringing from the shot. Silence. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. My flashlight beam flickered, and I quickly shook it, bringing the light back to full strength. I swept it across the trees, searching for any sign of the creature. But it was gone. I radioed in again. Static. My heart was still racing, but I knew I had to keep moving. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't safe here. I had to get back to the ranger station, and fast. I turned and started walking back the way I'd come, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, but I didn't see the creature again. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, my legs were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. I stumbled into the ranger station, slamming the door behind me, and collapsed into a chair. My hands were still shaking as I radioed for backup, this time getting through. When my colleagues arrived, I told them everything. We went back out to the trail the next morning, but the footprints were gone, and there was no sign of the creature. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. I still patrol those woods, but I'm never out there alone after dark anymore. Something is out there, lurking in the shadows. And whatever it is, it's watching, waiting, and it's not afraid of us. Story 4. The woods have eyes. I've always known this, but I never truly understood what it meant until that night in the Cascade Mountains. My name is Mike, and I'm about to tell you why I'll never go camping alone again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me, my tent, and the great outdoors. I'd been planning this solo trip for months, needing to clear my head after a rough patch at work. The Cascades seemed like the perfect escape. Vast, beautiful, and far from the noise of the city. I arrived at the trailhead late Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I shouldered my pack and started up the trail, I felt the stress of the past few months begin to melt away. This was exactly what I needed. The hike took longer than I'd anticipated. The sun was already dipping below the tree line by the time I found a suitable clearing to set up camp. I worked quickly, pitching my tent and gathering firewood before darkness fell completely. As I sat by the crackling fire, warming my hands and watching the stars emerge, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. This was why I came out here, to reconnect with nature, to remember what really mattered in life. But then I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing in the gathering gloom. Just shadows and more shadows. I shook it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. I was alone out here after all. It was natural to feel a little spooked. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight against the chill night air. I fell asleep to the sound of wind rustling through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe it was the sudden silence, the absence of nighttime forest sounds, or maybe it was that feeling again, stronger now, of eyes boring into me through the thin fabric of the tent. I lay there, heart pounding, straining my ears, and that's when I heard it, breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing, just outside my tent. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. It was too deliberate. I held my own breath, praying whatever it was would move on. Seconds stretched into minutes. The breathing continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of my tent. I could hear twigs snapping under heavy footsteps, could almost feel the presence of something large just inches away from me. Suddenly, there was a loud snuffling at the tent door. I bit back a scream as the whole structure shook, like something was pressing against it. The zipper started to move. In a panic, I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shouting as loud as I could, "Hey, get out of here!" The movement stopped abruptly. I heard a low growl, then the sound of something large crashing away through the underbrush. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally felt safe enough to emerge from my tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. My campsite was a mess. My backpack, which I'd left outside, was torn open, its contents strewn about. But it was the footprints that really got to me. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, with clear claw marks at the ends of the toes, and they were everywhere, circling my tent over and over again. I broke camp in record time, shoving everything haphazardly into my torn pack. I needed to get out of there fast. As I was about to leave, something caught my eye. There, on a nearby tree, about 7 feet up, were deep claw marks gouged into the bark. Fresh marks. I ran. I don't remember much of that hike back to my car, just the pounding of my heart and the constant feeling of being pursued. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of terror through me. When I finally reached my car, I was drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. I threw my pack in the back and peeled out of there, not slowing down until I hit the main highway. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a bear, though I've never heard of a bear acting quite like that. Maybe it was some kind of large wildcat, though the footprints didn't match. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I've done some research since then, read accounts of other hikers and campers who've had similar experiences. There are stories out there, whispered around campfires, of creatures in the woods that don't fit neatly into any known category. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wendigo, different names for something that might just be real. I don't know what visited my campsite that night. I don't want to know, but I do know this. I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes watching me, the sound of that breathing outside my tent, and I'll never ever go camping alone again. The woods have eyes, my friends, and sometimes they belong to things we can't explain. So if you find yourself out there, in the wild places of the world, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, don't ignore it. Because you might just be in the presence of something ancient, something primal, something that reminds us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. As for me, I stick to well-populated campgrounds these days, places with other people, with lights, with the comforting sounds of civilization. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself straining to hear a sound in the distance, the sound of heavy breathing, of massive footsteps, and I wonder if, somewhere out there in the darkness, it's looking for me too. Because the truth is, once you've had an encounter like mine, it changes you. You start to see the world differently. You realize that there are mysteries out there, things that defy explanation. And you can never quite shake the feeling that you're being watched. So the next time you're in the woods and you feel eyes upon you, remember my story. Remember that not all creatures out there are known to science. And remember, above all else, to respect the wilderness, because it's not just a playground for us humans. It's home to things we might never fully understand. As for me, I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've joined online forums, talked to cryptozoologists, even considered going back to those woods with a team of researchers. But every time I get close to planning another trip, I remember the terror of that night. The feeling of absolute vulnerability. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to face whatever's out there, to seek answers to the questions that have haunted me since that night. But for now, I'm content to share my story, to warn others about the hidden dangers that might be lurking in the shadows of our forests. Because knowledge is power, and in the face of the unknown, it might just be the thing that keeps us safe. So listen to the woods, respect their secrets, and always be prepared for the unexpected. Because you never know when you might find yourself face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and if you do, well, I hope you're faster than I was, because in the wild, when faced with the truly unknown, sometimes running is the only option left. Story 5. I've always been a skeptic. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, aliens, I'd roll my eyes at all of it. But after what happened that night in the Cascade Mountains, I'm not so sure anymore. Some things you can't explain away, no matter how hard you try. My name's Sarah, and this is the story of how a weekend camping trip turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It was supposed to be a romantic getaway. My boyfriend Tom and I had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the bustle of Seattle for a few days of peace in the wilderness. We chose a remote spot in the Cascades, known for its pristine beauty and, according to local legends, frequent Sasquatch sightings. You don't actually believe in that stuff, do you? I teased Tom as we packed our gear into the car. He grinned, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Come on, Sarah. Where's your sense of adventure? I laughed it off, but as we drove deeper into the mountains, leaving civilization behind, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The forest seemed to press in on us from all sides, ancient trees looming overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. We arrived at our campsite late in the afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a babbling creek nearby. As we set up our tent, I tried to shake off my nervousness, focusing instead on the beauty around us. See? Nothing to worry about, Tom said, wrapping an arm around me as we watched the sunset, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. We cooked dinner over a small campfire, talking and laughing as the stars came out overhead. It was peaceful, perfect even. But as the night wore on and the fire died down to embers, that feeling of unease returned. Did you hear that? I asked, interrupting Tom mid-sentence. He paused, listening. Hear what? I don't know. It sounded like something moving in the woods. Tom cocked his head, then shrugged. Probably just a deer or something. Come on, let's turn in. I want to get an early start on that hike tomorrow. I nodded, trying to convince myself he was right. We doused the fire and crawled into our tent, zipping it up tight against the chilly mountain air. Tom fell asleep almost immediately, his soft snores filling the small space. But I lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it, a sound so faint at first I thought I might be imagining it, the snap of a twig, followed by the rustle of leaves. Then another snap, closer this time. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sounds continued, growing louder, more deliberate. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was circling our campsite. Tom, I whispered, shaking his shoulder. Tom, wake up. He stirred, mumbling sleepily. What's wrong? There's something out there, I hissed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible. Tom sat up, instantly alert. We both froze, listening intently. For a moment, all was quiet. Then we heard it, a deep, rumbling breath, so close it seemed to vibrate the very air inside our tent. Tom's eyes widened, meeting mine in the darkness. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the flashlight we'd left by the tent door, but before he could grab it, something large bumped against the side of the tent, nearly collapsing it on top of us. I bit back a scream, clapping a hand over my mouth. Tom wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close as we huddled together, hardly daring to breathe. The thing outside, and there was no doubt now that it was something large and very much alive, continued to circle us. We could hear its heavy footsteps, the sound of branches snapping under its weight. Occasionally it would pause, and in those moments of silence we could hear its breathing, deep, ragged pants that sent chills down my spine. I don't know how long we sat there, frozen in terror. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually the sounds began to fade, moving off into the forest, but neither of us dared to move or speak until the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric. When we finally emerged, shaken and exhausted, the campsite was a mess. Our cooler had been overturned, its contents strewn about. Deep gouges marred the trunk of a nearby tree, as if something had been sharpening massive claws. But it was the footprints that truly made my blood run cold. They circled our tent, each one easily twice the size of my own foot, with a disturbingly human-like shape. What do you think made those?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but I think we should pack up and get out of here." I nodded emphatically, already moving to break down the tent. We worked quickly, constantly glancing over our shoulders at the surrounding forest. As I was stuffing the last of our gear into my backpack, something caught my eye. Tangled in a low-hanging branch at the edge of our campsite was a clump of hair, long, coarse, and a reddish-brown color I'd never seen on any animal in these woods. "Tom!" I called out, my voice shaking. "Come look at this!" He joined me, carefully untangling the hair from the branch. We stared at it, then at each other, the same unspoken question in both our eyes. What the hell had visited us last night? The hike back to our car was tense, to say the least. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping, imagining massive, hairy figures lurking just out of sight. When we finally reached the parking area, I nearly cried with relief. As we drove back to Seattle, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, we said, a very large bipedal bear that breathed like a person and left human-like footprints. Even as the words left our mouths, we knew how ridiculous they sounded. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that deep, rumbling breath, feel the presence of something massive and unknown just outside the thin fabric of the tent. Tom and I pored over websites dedicated to Bigfoot sightings, comparing our experience to others. Some of the stories were clearly hoaxes, but others sounded disturbingly similar to what we'd encountered. We debated whether to report our experience. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of town, dismissed as attention seekers or crazies. So we kept it to ourselves, a secret that hung between us, unspoken but always present. But the experience changed us. Tom threw himself into researching cryptozoology, spending hours online and even joining local Bigfoot hunting groups. I found myself unable to look at the forests around Seattle the same way. Every time I'd go for a hike, I'd find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a massive, hairy figure watching me. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Or as normal as it could be when you're carrying around a secret like ours. We still went camping, still enjoyed the outdoors, but always with an underlying tension, a heightened awareness of our surroundings. It was almost a year later when we saw the news report. A group of hikers in the Cascades, not far from where we'd camped, had captured footage of what they claimed was a Sasquatch. The video, shaky and unclear, showed a large bipedal figure moving through the trees. As I watched the clip, my heart racing, I felt Tom's hand slip into mine. We didn't need to speak. We both knew what the other was thinking. That could have been us. That could have been our story. In the days that followed, as debates raged online about the authenticity of the footage, Tom and I had many long discussions. Should we come forward with our story? Would it help or hurt the investigation? In the end, we decided to reach out to the research team analyzing the video, sharing our experience anonymously. I don't know if what we encountered that night was truly a Sasquatch. I'm still not sure I believe in the legends, despite what we experienced. But I do know this: there are things out there, in the dark forests of this world, that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and knowledge, nature still holds mysteries we have yet to unravel. So the next time you're in the woods and you hear a twig snap or feel eyes upon you, remember our story. And maybe, just maybe, think twice before dismissing those old legends. Because sometimes the line between myth and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. Story 6. The fire crackled weakly in front of us, barely keeping the darkness at bay. Every sound in the forest felt amplified: the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of something that might have been the wind. Or maybe it wasn't. Jack and I had been out here plenty of times, but this time, it felt different. I shifted uneasily on the log, poking at the fire with a stick. Jack sat across from me, staring into the flames, his face bathed in the soft orange glow. He was trying to act cool, like nothing was wrong, but I could see it in his eyes. He felt it too, that sense of being watched, of something just beyond the light lurking in the trees. "Dude, you hear that?" Jack asked suddenly, his voice low, barely above a whisper. I froze, my stick halfway to the fire. For a second, I didn't hear anything, just the soft crackling of the embers and the occasional chirp of crickets. But then it came. Faint at first, almost like footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Something was moving out there, circling the edge of our camp. I straightened up, my heart rate picking up. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I hear it." We were deep in the Montana wilderness, far from any trail or campsite. We'd hiked miles off the beaten path to get here, to this isolated little clearing by the river. No one else was out here. It was just us. So, what the hell was making that sound? I glanced at Jack. He had his hand on the handle of his knife, but he wasn't moving. He was listening, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The footsteps, if that's what they were, seemed to stop, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. "Maybe it's an elk," I offered weakly, though I didn't believe it for a second. Elk didn't move like that. Hell, nothing I knew moved like that. Jack shook his head slowly. "That ain't an elk." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. The light flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out into the forest. I gripped my stick tighter, though I had no idea what I planned to do with it. My eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, searching for any movement, any sign of what was out there. Nothing, just trees and shadows, and that oppressive feeling that something was watching us. "I don't like this, man," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, still staring into the woods. "Yeah, me neither." We sat there in tense silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. The forest around us had gone unnervingly quiet, the usual night sounds of insects and small animals replaced by nothing, just that heavy, suffocating silence. Then, without warning, there was a loud snap, like a tree branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. Jack shot to his feet, his knife drawn, eyes wide and alert. I jumped up too, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound had come from just beyond the tree line, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. Too close. "Okay, that's not normal," I whispered, trying to steady my breathing. "That's not normal, Jack." Jack didn't respond. He was staring intently into the darkness, his entire body tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The fire between us flickered, casting erratic shadows over his face, making him look almost as wild as the forest around us. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Now!" Jack didn't argue. He nodded, but before we could even begin to pack up, we heard it again. The heavy, deliberate footsteps moving closer. Slow, measured, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where we were and wasn't in any hurry. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my backpack, not caring about the rest of our gear. We could come back for it later, if there was a later. "We're leaving," I said firmly, yanking the straps of my pack over my shoulders. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He was already moving, stuffing his essentials into his bag, eyes darting around nervously. The footsteps stopped again, just beyond the light of the fire. It was like whatever was out there was waiting for us to make a move. The moment we stepped away from the fire, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was stepping out of the only safe place in the world and into the jaws of something I couldn't see. The darkness pressed in around us, and the beam from my flashlight seemed pitifully weak as I swept it across the trees. "Stay close," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. We moved quickly but quietly, heading toward the river. It wasn't far, maybe a few 100 yards, but every step felt like it took an eternity. The sounds around us were deafening now, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches, the distant rush of the river. And behind it all, I could hear those footsteps again. They were closer now, following us. I didn't dare look back. We broke through the tree line and onto the rocky bank of the river. The water rushed by, dark and cold, illuminated only by the faint sliver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. Jack turned to me, his face pale in the dim light. "We follow the river downstream," he said, his voice tight. "It'll take us back to the main trail. We just need to keep moving." I nodded, too scared to speak. My entire body was trembling with adrenaline and fear. We started moving along the riverbank, our flashlights sweeping back and forth, trying to pierce the inky blackness. The sound of the river should have been comforting, a reminder that we weren't completely lost. But it wasn't. It just added to the noise, to the confusion. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind us. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. Jack stopped too, his head snapping toward the sound. We both stood there, motionless, listening. The growl came again, deeper this time, more menacing. "That's not a bear," I whispered, though I didn't need to say it. We both knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't anything we'd ever encountered before. "We keep moving," Jack said, his voice shaking just a little. "We don't stop, no matter what." We started moving again, faster this time, practically jogging along the uneven ground. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else, but I knew that growl was still out there. I could feel it, like a presence just on the edge of my awareness, closing in. Then something crashed through the trees behind us. I whipped around, shining my flashlight toward the noise, but I didn't see anything, just shadows. "Go!" Jack shouted, and we both broke into a full sprint. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I could hear Jack behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding the ground. But behind him, I could hear something else, something bigger, something faster. The river roared beside us, the noise drowning out everything but the pounding of my own heartbeat. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep running, to get as far away from that thing as possible. Suddenly, Jack let out a yelp of pain, and I heard him hit the ground hard. I skidded to a stop, turning around to see him sprawled out on the rocky bank, clutching his ankle. "I twisted it," he gasped, his face twisted in pain. I rushed over to him, panic surging through me. "We have to keep moving," I shouted, grabbing his arm and trying to haul him to his feet. But it was too late. The thing that had been stalking us stepped out of the trees, looming over us like a nightmare come to life. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the beam of my flashlight, and it was staring right at us. I froze, my mind going blank with terror. Jack was struggling to stand, but his ankle was clearly messed up. We weren't going to outrun this thing. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, baring its teeth. I could feel its hot, rancid breath on my face. I stood there, trembling as it took a step toward us. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, hoping that somehow, someone, anyone, would hear us. The creature paused, its head cocking slightly to the side, as if it was confused, and then, to my utter disbelief, it turned and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't wait to see if it was coming back. I grabbed Jack, half carrying, half dragging him down the riverbank, moving as fast as I could. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail hours later, exhausted, bruised, and barely able to speak. We never talked about what happened that night. We never went back to that part of the woods again. And we never forgot those eyes, watching us from the darkness. Story 7. The scream that echoed through the darkening forest wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something in between, something that made my blood run cold and my wife's hand tighten around mine. We were lost. Night was falling, and something was out there with us. My name's Tom, and what I'm about to tell you happened last fall during what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway with my wife Sarah. We'd been married for 5 years, and with our busy lives in the city, we rarely got a chance to spend quality time together. So when we saw an ad for a quaint little cabin in the mountains, it seemed perfect. We arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The fall colors were at their peak, painting the mountainside in vibrant reds, oranges, and golds. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. It was exactly what we needed. Saturday morning, we decided to go for a hike. The cabin owner had left a crude map of the local trails, and we picked one that promised spectacular views of the valley. We packed some sandwiches, filled our water bottles, and set off, hand in hand, into the woods. The first few hours were idyllic. The trail wound through stands of towering pines and across babbling brooks. We stopped for lunch on a rocky outcropping, marveling at the sweeping vistas below us. Sarah laughed as I tried to identify bird calls, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension leave my shoulders. It was on our way back that things started to go wrong. We came to a fork in the trail that neither of us remembered passing earlier. The map was no help. It was too general to show this level of detail. We debated for a few minutes before choosing the path that seemed to head in the right direction. An hour later, we realized our mistake. The trail had gradually become less defined, eventually petering out into nothing more than a game trail. We were lost. I checked my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. A chill wind picked up, carrying with it the first hints of the coming night. We should head back. Try to retrace our steps, Sarah suggested, a tremor of worry in her voice. I nodded, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Good idea. We can't be that far off track. We turned around, but in the fading light, everything looked different. Each tree, each rock formation that I thought I recognized, turned out to be unfamiliar upon closer inspection. The forest seemed to close in around us. The friendly woods of the morning transformed into something darker, more primeval. As the last of the daylight faded, panic began to set in. We were lost in the wilderness, unprepared for a night in the open. I had a small flashlight in my backpack, but its weak beam did little to pierce the encompassing darkness. That's when we heard it, a sound that made us both freeze in our tracks. It started as a low moan, rising quickly to a hair-raising shriek that echoed through the trees. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, Not quite human, but somehow a horrifying mixture of both. Sarah's hand clamped down on mine, her nails digging into my skin. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I shook my head, unable to speak. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I knew that panicking now would only make our situation worse. "It's probably just a mountain lion or something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to find shelter, build a fire if we can." We pushed on through the darkness, straining our ears for any sound of pursuit. The forest had gone eerily quiet in the wake of that unearthly scream, as if every creature was holding its breath. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center was a massive old oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like protective arms. It wasn't much, but it was the best shelter we were likely to find. We huddled at the base of the tree, our backs pressed against its rough bark. I gathered what dry leaves and twigs I could find nearby, attempting to start a fire with shaking hands. It took several tries, but finally a small flame sputtered to life. The meager fire cast flickering shadows around our little sanctuary, barely holding back the pressing darkness. Sarah huddled close to me, and I could feel her trembling. "It's going to be okay," I murmured, as much to reassure myself as her. "We'll wait out the night here and find our way back in the morning." That's when we heard it again, that bone-chilling scream, closer this time, much closer. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush, snapping branches and rustling leaves. Sarah whimpered, burying her face in my chest. I held her tight, my eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. The sounds of movement grew louder, circling our position. Whatever it was big, and there was a deliberateness to its movements that spoke of intelligence. This wasn't just some animal stumbling upon us by chance. I could hear heavy breathing now, punctuated by low, guttural noises that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was just beyond the reach of our firelight, hidden in the shadows. "Tom," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something out there." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I reached for a burning branch, holding it out like a weapon. Its light pushed back the darkness a few more feet, and for a split second I saw something that turned my blood to ice. A pair of eyes, reflecting the firelight, hovering about 7 feet off the ground. They weren't the eyes of any animal I recognized. There was an intelligence there, a malevolence that was unmistakably otherworldly. As quickly as I saw them, they were gone, blinked out of existence, but I could still hear it out there, circling, waiting. We spent the night like that, huddled together, jumping at every sound. I kept the fire going, using it as a barrier between us and whatever was lurking in the darkness. Neither of us slept, too terrified of what might happen if we let our guard down. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the sounds finally stopped. Whatever had been stalking us throughout the night seemed to have retreated with the coming of day. We waited until the sun was fully up before we dared to leave our makeshift sanctuary. In the light of day, we quickly found the main trail and made our way back to the cabin. We packed up and left immediately, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the city. We've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was just an animal, our fears amplified by the darkness and our predicament. Maybe we imagined it all, a shared delusion brought on by stress and exhaustion. But in my heart, I know what I saw. Those eyes, that intelligence, it was something beyond our understanding, something that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. We don't go hiking anymore, Sarah and I. We've found other hobbies, other ways to spend our weekends. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside our bedroom window, I find myself thinking about those woods. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, that creature is still roaming, still hunting, and I hope for the sake of anyone who might wander into its territory that they have better luck than we did. because there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that remind us that we're not always at the top of the food chain, and sometimes the best we can do is huddle close to our fires and pray for the coming of the dawn. Story 8. I've been a hunter for 30 years. Tracked every animal these mountains have to offer, but nothing in all those years could have prepared me for what I encountered that day. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip. Instead, it became the day I questioned everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. My name's John, and this is the story of the hunt that changed my life. It was early November, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I'd taken a week off work for my annual solo hunting trip in the Rockies, a tradition I'd kept since my father first taught me to hunt. As I drove up the winding mountain road, my old pickup loaded with gear, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and peace that always came with these trips. I set up camp in a small clearing I'd used for years, my tent nestled between two towering pines. The first couple of days were uneventful. I bagged a few grouse, saw some promising deer signs, but nothing extraordinary. It was on the third morning that everything changed. I woke before dawn as usual and set out just as the first light was breaking over the mountains. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, perfect for tracking. I was feeling good, confident. This was my element after all. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across a set of tracks that stopped me in my tracks. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before, huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, with a shape that was disturbingly human-like, yet not quite right. At first I thought it must be a bear print, distorted by the melting snow, but as I knelt to examine it more closely, I realized that couldn't be the case. The stride length alone suggested whatever made these was walking on 2 legs and stood well over 7 feet tall. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. I've encountered plenty of bears in my time, even had a few close calls. But this was something else entirely. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the tracks. They led deeper into the forest, away from any trails I knew. As I walked, the trees seemed to grow denser, the shadows deeper. I found myself constantly scanning my surroundings. My rifle held just a little tighter than usual. I'd been following the tracks for maybe an hour when I heard it, a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was a howl, but not like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. This was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I froze, my eyes darting around the forest. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by a stand of trees, was a figure. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. For a split second our eyes met. Its eyes were startlingly intelligent, almost human-like in their depth. Then, faster than something that size should be able to move, it was gone, vanishing into the thick underbrush. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to chase after it, to prove to myself that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing, but a deeper, more primal part of me screamed to turn around, to get as far away from this place as possible. In the end, self-preservation won out. I turned and started making my way back to camp, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The forest, which had always been a second home to me, suddenly felt alien and threatening. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, half expecting to see that massive, fur-covered figure looming over me. I made it back to my campsite as the sun was setting, my legs burning from the pace I'd set. As I approached my tent, I noticed something was off. There were tracks around my camp, the same massive human-like prints I'd been following all day. My hands shaking, I unzipped the tent. Everything inside was a mess, as if something large had rummaged through my belongings. My food cache, which I'd carefully hung in a tree to keep away from bears, had been torn down, the contents strewn across the ground. That's when I noticed the claw marks, deep gouges in the bark of the trees surrounding my camp, far too high up to have been made by a bear. Whatever had done this stood upright, and it was big. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a tree, my rifle across my lap, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn broke, I'd made my decision. I was getting out of there. I packed up as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. As I was loading the last of my gear into my truck, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, on the hood of my vehicle, were 3 long, deep scratches in the metal. They hadn't been there the day before. The drive down the mountain was tense, to say the least. I kept replaying the events of the previous day in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Had it really been as big as I remembered? Could it have been a bear, standing on its hind legs? But those eyes, those weren't the eyes of any animal I'd ever encountered. When I got back to civilization, I debated whether to report what I'd seen. In the end, I decided against it. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of town, dismissed as another crazy who'd had too much whiskey around the campfire, but I couldn't just forget about it either. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I pored over books on local wildlife, spent hours on online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. And the more I read, the more I began to believe that what I'd encountered might have been what some people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have thought they were nuts. But after what I saw, what I experienced, I can't just dismiss it. I've been back to those mountains several times since that day. I tell myself it's for hunting, but deep down, I know the truth. I'm looking for it, hoping for another glimpse, for proof that I'm not crazy, that what I saw was real. I haven't seen the creature again, but I've found things, more of those massive footprints, tufts of coarse dark hair caught on tree bark. Once, I even found what looked like a crude shelter, too big for any human but constructed with an intelligence that no known animal possesses. Each time I go back, I'm a little more prepared. I've got a better camera, audio recording equipment, even some plaster to make casts of any prints I find. But each time, I'm also a little more nervous, because I know now that I'm not the hunter anymore. Out there, in those mountains, there's something bigger, something smarter. And it knows I'm looking for it. Sometimes, when I'm sitting around my campfire at night, I swear I can feel eyes on me. I'll hear a twig snap in the darkness, or catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze. And in those moments, I'm right back there, staring into those impossibly intelligent eyes through the trees. I don't know if I'll ever find the proof I'm looking for. Maybe it's better if I don't. But I do know this. Those mountains hold secrets, things that defy our understanding of the natural world. And once you've seen behind that veil, there's no going back. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and you hear something moving in the shadows, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that we can't explain, creatures that blur the line between legend and reality. And maybe, just maybe, think twice before dismissing those old campfire tales, because sometimes the monsters in the woods are all too real. Story 9. When the radio crackled to life just before dusk, I could hear the panic in the man's voice on the other end. It wasn't the kind of panic you hear from lost hikers or campers who can't find their way back to the trailhead. No, this was deeper, rawer. He was terrified. There's something out here. We're by the river, near the old campsite. We need help. Now. The voice broke, like the guy was holding back tears. I could hear other voices in the background, hushed and frantic, but I couldn't make out the words. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. My shift was almost over, and I was packing up to head back to the ranger station when the call came through. I had done my fair share of rescues before, and I figured it was probably another group that had gotten themselves lost or spooked by a bear. But something about the way that man sounded got under my skin. "This is Ranger Ben," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." I grabbed my flashlight, radio and gun, then set off toward the location the man had mentioned. It wasn't far, maybe a mile or two downriver from the station, but it was getting dark fast, and the woods had a way of swallowing the last bit of light. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching against the trail as the trees closed in around me. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the insects, the rustling of leaves, had gone eerily quiet. Too quiet. My instincts told me something was wrong. I reached the river about 20 minutes later, panting slightly from the brisk hike. The campsite the man had mentioned was one we rarely used anymore. It had been abandoned after a bad storm had knocked down a few trees, making it unsafe for the usual weekend campers. But some people still knew about it and ventured out there from time to time, mostly those who wanted to escape the more crowded trails. I shined my flashlight across the riverbank. At first, everything seemed normal. The water rushed quietly over the rocks. The trees stood tall and silent, and the air was crisp with the cool evening breeze. But then I saw them, the footprints, huge. My stomach dropped as I crouched down for a better look. They were massive, much larger than any human footprint, and they looked fresh, pressed deep into the soft mud by the river. I ran my fingers over the edge of one print, feeling the weight of whatever had made them. My first thought was a bear, maybe a big one, but the shape was wrong. Bears don't leave prints like this. This looked more human. A chill ran down my spine, and I stood up quickly, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam flickered over the trees, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the light. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it, that sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I gripped the handle of my gun tighter, even though I had no idea what I was dealing with. I tried the radio again. "This is Ranger Ben. I'm at the river. Can you give me your location?" Silence. I tried again. "I need you to respond. Is anyone there?" More static. The signal should have been strong enough here. There was no reason for the radio to cut out like this. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. I had dealt with my share of bear encounters, snake bites, and the occasional lost hiker. But this was different. I followed the trail of footprints deeper into the woods, moving cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the thickening darkness. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and every step I took seemed to echo in the unnatural quiet of the forest. The footprints continued, leading away from the river, but something else caught my eye. Dark spots on the leaves and the ground. I crouched down again, holding the flashlight close. Blood, fresh. I straightened up quickly, scanning the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, horribly wrong. There was a sharp, metallic tang in the air, the unmistakable smell of blood mixing with the earthy scent of the forest floor. My stomach churned as the uneasy feeling tightened in my chest. The trail of blood led further into the woods, and against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I followed. I had to know what happened to the people who made that call. As I pushed through the thick underbrush, I saw something up ahead, a clearing bathed in the weak glow of the moonlight breaking through the canopy. And there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was the campsite, or what was left of it. Tents had been ripped open, their fabric hanging in shreds from the frames. Gear was strewn across the ground, sleeping bags, backpacks, clothes, all scattered like someone had left in a hurry. The campfire was still smouldering, but no one was there. No voices, no footsteps, just the remnants of a campsite that had been violently abandoned. And then I saw the blood, a lot of it. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped into the clearing, shining my light on the ground. It was everywhere, splattered across the dirt, smeared on the torn tents, and soaking into the leaves. My mouth went dry, and I had to fight the urge to run. Something bad had happened here. Something very bad. I reached for my radio again, my hand shaking slightly. "This is Ranger Ben. I'm at the campsite, but there's no one here, just blood." My voice sounded thin, even to my own ears. "If anyone can hear this, respond." Static. I lowered the radio, my mind racing. Where were they? What could have done this? I thought about the footprints by the river, the blood trail, the torn tents. None of it made sense. It was like something out of a nightmare. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly I turned, raising my flashlight to scan the tree line. The beam flickered across the trunks, casting long, eerie shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the darkness between the trees. But then, movement. Something was out there, something big. I stepped backward, my pulse racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Whatever it was huge, towering above the underbrush, its dark, hulking form barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I reached for my gun, my fingers fumbling with the holster. The growl came again, deeper this time, rumbling through the trees like thunder. My hand shook as I drew the gun, holding it out in front of me, the barrel trembling in the dim light. And then, with a sudden, terrifying speed, the thing moved. It crashed through the trees, its footsteps heavy, its breathing loud and ragged. I fired, the gunshot echoing through the woods, but it didn't stop. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. Branches whipped at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet as I sprinted through the forest, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, gaining on me. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I couldn't stop, not now. I burst through the trees and onto the riverbank, stumbling as I skidded to a stop. The river rushed by in front of me, its surface dark and cold. I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the thing had stopped. It stood at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, watching me. I could see its glowing eyes, piercing through the darkness, but it didn't move. It just stood there, silent, waiting. I backed toward the river, my gun still raised, though my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could fire again if I needed to. The thing growled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. Then, slowly, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. I don't know what it was, but I knew one thing for certain. It had let me go. I didn't stick around to find out why. I turned and ran along the riverbank, not stopping until I reached the ranger station, my mind still spinning with what I had seen. When I got back, I radioed for help, and a search team was sent out to the campsite. But by the time they arrived, there was no trace of the blood, the footprints, or the creature. Just an empty campsite and the unsettling knowledge that something was still out there. Story 10. The moment I saw it in the photograph, my world changed forever. A blur in the background, barely noticeable at first glance, but unmistakably there. Something that shouldn't exist, captured by my camera in a split second of serendipity or cosmic joke. Little did I know that this accidental shot would lead me down a rabbit hole of mystery, fear, and obsession. My name is Dave, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've spent the better part of 2 decades traipsing through forests, swamps, and mountains, capturing images of nature in all its raw beauty. I thought I'd seen it all, from elusive snow leopards in the Himalayas to rare birds in the Amazon rainforest. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. A magazine had commissioned me to photograph the diverse wildlife in Olympic National Park. I'd been there before and was looking forward to revisiting some of my favorite spots: the ancient trees, the misty mountains, the abundant wildlife. It was a photographer's paradise. I set up camp in a secluded area, far from the tourist trails. The first few days were productive but uneventful. I got some great shots of Roosevelt elk, captured a family of river otters at play, and even managed to photograph a rarely seen fisher. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. I was set up near a small clearing, hoping to catch some deer in the early morning light. As the sun began to rise, painting the forest in a golden glow, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I raised my camera, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a bear. Click, click, click. I took a rapid series of shots as the animal moved through the clearing. It was fast, much faster than I anticipated, and in the low light I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but something felt off. The way it moved wasn't quite right for any animal I knew. It wasn't until later that evening, as I was reviewing the day's shots on my laptop, that I saw it. In one frame, partially obscured by a tree and blurred by motion, was a figure that made my heart skip a beat. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, and covered in what looked like dark fur. But it was the posture that really got me, unmistakably bipedal, with long arms that nearly reached its knees. I stared at the image for hours, zooming in, adjusting the contrast, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? A man in a suit? Or was it something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend and campfire stories? The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it. It had to be a trick of the light, a bizarre combination of shadows and motion blur. But deep down, I knew what I was looking at. I'd captured an image of something that defied explanation. A creature that looked eerily like what people described as Bigfoot. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I tell someone? Would anyone believe me? Or would I be laughed out of the photography community, branded as a hoaxer or a crackpot? In the end, curiosity won out over caution. I decided to extend my stay in the park and investigate further. I needed to know if what I'd photographed was real or just a fluke, a one-in-a-million coincidence. The next few days were a blur of hiking, setting up camera traps, and scanning the forest for any sign of the creature. I found myself jumping at every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush. The forest that had once felt like a second home now seemed alien and threatening. On the third night of my extended stay, I woke to the sound of something large moving around my campsite. My heart pounding, I unzipped my tent just enough to peer out. In the pale moonlight, I saw a dark figure rummaging through my gear. It was huge, far larger than a bear, and moved with an unsettling mix of grace and power. I held my breath, afraid to move, afraid to even blink. The creature paused, and for a moment I swear it looked directly at me. 2 eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight. There was an intelligence there, a consciousness that was undeniably non-animal. As quickly as it had appeared, the figure melted back into the forest, leaving me shaken and questioning my sanity. Was I really seeing these things, or was the solitude and the weight of my discovery playing tricks on my mind? The next morning, I found my campsite in disarray. My backpack had been torn open, its contents strewn about, but it was the footprints that really drove home the reality of what I'd seen. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own feet, with 5 distinct toes and a shape that was almost human-like, but not quite. I photographed the prints meticulously, using my lens cap for scale. Then I packed up my gear and headed back to civilization. I needed to process what I'd seen, to figure out my next move. Back in my small apartment in Seattle, I spent weeks poring over the evidence I'd gathered. The blurry photograph, the footprint images, my own hastily scribbled notes. I researched Bigfoot sightings, delved into cryptozoology forums, and even reached out to a few scientists who were open to discussing the possibility of undiscovered primates. The more I dug, the more obsessed I became. My other work fell by the wayside as I focused all my energy on proving what I'd seen. I planned another trip to Olympic National Park, this time with better equipment and a more systematic approach to my search. But as I prepared for my return to the forest, a nagging doubt began to creep in. What if I did find definitive proof? What would that mean for the creature, for the forest it called home? Would my discovery lead to an invasion of curiosity seekers and would-be monster hunters, disrupting the delicate balance of the ecosystem? On the eve of my planned departure, I sat at my desk, staring at the blurry photograph that had started it all. In that moment, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I closed my laptop, packed away my research, and cancelled my trip. Some mysteries, I realized, are better left unsolved. The magic of the forest, the wonder of the unknown. These were things that no photograph, no matter how clear, could ever truly capture. And perhaps, in a world where every inch of the planet has been mapped and catalogued, we need these mysteries. We need to believe that there are still wonders out there, still unexplained phenomena that remind us of how vast and mysterious our world really is. I never went public with my photograph or my experience, but on quiet nights, when the city sleeps and the moon is full, I find myself drawn to the window, looking out towards the distant mountains, and I wonder if, somewhere in those vast forests, something extraordinary is looking back. The truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of ancient trees and misty valleys, and sometimes just knowing it exists is enough. Because in a world of certainties and cold, hard facts, a little mystery can be a beautiful thing. As for me, I've returned to my regular wildlife photography. But every time I raise my camera, every time I focus my lens on a subject, there's a part of me that hopes and fears that I might once again capture something unexplainable, because once you've glimpsed the impossible, you never quite see the world the same way again. Story 11. I've always believed that every sound in nature has an explanation. As a wildlife documentarian, it's been my job to capture and understand those sounds. But what I recorded in the depths of the Olympic National Forest defied all logical explanation, and it's haunted me ever since. My name is Emily, and this is the story of how a routine filming expedition turned into a nightmare that I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. It was supposed to be a straightforward assignment. My production company had sent me to the Olympic Peninsula to gather footage for a documentary about the local ecosystem. I was excited. The area was known for its diverse wildlife and stunning landscapes. What I didn't know was that it was also the setting for numerous local legends about strange creatures lurking in the vast, primeval forests. I arrived in early October, just as the fall colours were starting to paint the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. My base camp was a small clearing near the Ho River, surrounded by towering cedars and spruce trees dripping with moss. It was beautiful, but there was something about the density of the forest that made me feel small and vulnerable. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time setting up camera traps, filming scenic vistas, and recording the ambient sounds of the forest. It was peaceful work, the kind that reminds you why you fell in love with nature in the first place. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. I was in my tent, reviewing the day's footage on my laptop, when I first heard it. A low, mournful sound that started so quietly I almost missed it. At first, I thought it might be the wind, or perhaps a far-off wolf. But as it grew louder, I realized it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The howl, because that's what it was, a howl, was deep and resonant, with an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I scrambled for my audio equipment, hands shaking as I set up my most sensitive microphone. The howl came again, louder this time, and I felt it in my chest, a vibration that seemed to rattle my very bones. As I listened, transfixed, the howl changed. It became more complex, almost like speech, but in no language I'd ever heard. There were peaks and troughs, patterns that seemed to repeat. This wasn't just an animal call, it felt like communication. The recording lasted for nearly 5 minutes before fading away, leaving behind a silence that felt oppressive in its totality. I sat there in my tent, heart pounding, straining my ears for any follow-up sound. But there was nothing, no rustling leaves, no snapping twigs. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Sleep was out of the question after that. I spent the rest of the night replaying the recording, trying to match it to any known animal call, but nothing came close. The closest I could come was that it sounded like a cross between a wolf's howl and a human's scream, but even that didn't quite capture its otherworldly quality. As dawn broke, I ventured out of my tent, half expecting to find some sign of whatever had made that sound, but the forest looked exactly as it had the day before. No unusual tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. I spent the day in a daze, going through the motions of my work while constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow in the trees made me jump. I felt watched, though I never saw anything concrete to justify that feeling. As night fell again, I faced a decision. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pack up and leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the documentarian in me, the part that lived for discovering new things, insisted on staying. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I set up my equipment again, this time with multiple microphones placed around my camp. If that sound came back, I was determined to capture it from every angle. The wait was excruciating. Hours passed with nothing but the normal nighttime sounds of the forest. Just as I was beginning to think the previous night had been some sort of auditory hallucination, I heard it again. The howl started low, just like before, but quickly grew in volume and complexity. I sat perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, as my equipment recorded the eerie sound. It lasted longer this time, nearly 10 minutes of undulating speech-like howls that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Then, just as it reached a crescendo, I heard something else. The unmistakable sound of bipedal footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the underbrush nearby. Fear gripped me like a physical force. I wanted to run, to hide, but I was paralyzed, unable to do anything but listen as the footsteps drew closer. They circled my camp once, twice before fading back into the forest. The howling continued for a few more minutes before tapering off, leaving behind a silence that was somehow even more terrifying than the sound had been. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent clutching my camera like a lifeline, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, I was a wreck, exhausted and on edge. But daylight brought with it a renewed determination. I had evidence now, clear audio recordings of something that shouldn't exist. I spent the morning reviewing the footage, and what I found only deepened the mystery. The recordings were crystal clear, capturing every nuance of that strange, howling voice. But what really caught my attention were the subharmonics, frequencies below the range of human hearing that my equipment had picked up. These complex, layered sounds were unlike anything I'd ever seen in animal vocalizations. They were structured, almost like a language. I knew I needed expert opinions. I sent the audio files to a couple of colleagues, a bioacoustician who specialized in animal vocalizations, and a linguist who studied the structure of human language. Their responses came back quickly, and they were both baffled. The bioacoustician said the sounds didn't match any known animal, while the linguist noted that the vocalizations had structural elements similar to human speech, but in patterns he'd never encountered before. As the days wore on, I found myself becoming obsessed with the mystery. I extended my stay, much to the confusion of my producers back home. I set up more camera traps, spent hours hiking through the forest, looking for any sign of the creature that had made those sounds. I didn't hear the howling again, but I found other things. Strange tracks in muddy areas, tufts of coarse hair caught on tree bark, and once a clear handprint in some soft earth that was far too large to be human. Each discovery only deepened the mystery. I compiled my evidence meticulously, but I was reluctant to share it widely. I knew how it would sound, another crazy story about Bigfoot or some other mythical forest creature. I'd built my career on scientific rigor and objectivity. I wasn't ready to risk that on something I couldn't explain or prove, but the experience changed me. I found myself looking at the forest differently, always scanning the trees, always listening for that otherworldly howl. I jumped at shadows, startled at every snapping twig. The wilderness that had once been my sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. As my assignment came to an end, I faced a dilemma. I had hours of fascinating footage for the documentary, breathtaking shots of the landscape and wildlife. But I also had those recordings, that evidence of something unexplainable lurking in the forest depths. In the end, I decided to keep the strange encounters to myself, at least for now. I submitted my official footage, which was well received by the production company. But I kept copies of everything else, the audio recordings, the photos of the tracks and hair samples, my detailed notes. Someday, I told myself, I'd find a way to share this story, to unravel the mystery of what I'd encountered in those woods. I've been back to the Olympic National Forest several times since then. I tell myself it's for work, but deep down, I know the truth. I'm searching for answers, for another glimpse of whatever it was that I encountered there. I haven't heard that howl again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest at night, I feel a presence. I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze or see a shadow move in a way that no shadow should. And in those moments, I'm right back there, listening to that impossible sound echoing through the trees. I don't know if I'll ever solve the mystery of what I encountered in those woods. But I do know this. There are things out there in the dark corners of our world that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and knowledge, nature still holds secrets we have yet to unravel. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you hear a sound you can't quite place, remember my story. And maybe, just maybe, consider that some legends might have more truth to them than we'd like to believe. Story 12. The forest at night is a different world. What feels peaceful during the day turns sinister when the sun goes down. The trees, once familiar and harmless, become towering shadows. The gentle rustle of leaves is no longer soothing. It's a whispering reminder that you're alone out here. But that night, sitting in the tower, I didn't feel alone. I felt like something was watching me. My name is Marcus, and this was my first week working as a park ranger, doing the night shift in a fire watchtower. Most of the time, it's just boring. You sit, you scan the forest for smoke or anything unusual, you log it. Easy work, right? Except tonight, there was something off. It wasn't just the usual quiet, isolated feeling. It was that sense deep in my gut that something was out there, something more than just trees and wildlife. The wind had picked up, making the old tower creak as it swayed slightly. The radio crackled every now and then with static, but nothing came through. I looked out through the dirty glass windows, scanning the dark treetops with my flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, bouncing off the branches, but all I could see was an endless sea of trees stretching out into the night. The stars above were faint, hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. No moon, no real light except for my flashlight and the small lamp on the desk beside me. I leaned back in the creaky wooden chair, trying to shake off the tension creeping up my spine. It was just another quiet night. That's what I kept telling myself. But every so often I'd hear something, faint, barely there, like footsteps. They came from far below the tower, somewhere in the dense woods. Every time I stood up to listen more closely, it stopped. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind playing tricks. But after an hour or so I couldn't shake the feeling. The footsteps, if that's what they were getting louder, closer. I stood up again, grabbing the flashlight and stepping out onto the tower's narrow platform. The cool night air hit my face, a welcome change from the stale warmth of the small cabin. I shined the light down, scanning the base of the tower. Nothing. Just the wind stirring the bushes, the trees gently swaying. But that sound, it wasn't gone. I could hear it now, faint but steady, like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. I flicked off the light, standing completely still, holding my breath. My pulse quickened as I listened. There, definite footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Something was down there, circling the tower. I clenched the flashlight tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd heard about bears getting curious and coming close to human structures. But this didn't sound like a bear. It was too rhythmic, too calculated. I backed slowly into the cabin and shut the door behind me, locking it. Not that a flimsy lock on a tower 60 feet in the air would do much good. I tried the radio again, but it was nothing but static. The nearest ranger station was at least 30 miles away, and I was out here alone. I sat down, trying to calm myself, but that sense of unease was growing. My eyes flicked to the small window next to the door. Something about the darkness out there felt too thick, too oppressive. I could still hear the faint crunch of footsteps, now circling the tower more quickly. My flashlight lay on the desk, useless. My hand hovered over my gun, holstered at my hip. I didn't want to need it, but I wasn't sure I had a choice. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My skin crawled as I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the creaking of the tower in the wind. I slowly moved to the window and glanced out, my heart in my throat. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark mass of trees. But then, in the corner of my eye, something shifted. A shadow. A figure. It stood at the base of the tower, just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any details, but it was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen. My mouth went dry as I stared, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that it was just a trick of the light. But then it moved. It started to walk, slowly and deliberately, around the tower again, this time closer. The boards under my feet creaked as I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on again, pointing it down at the base. The beam caught the edge of the figure just as it stepped out of view into the shadow of the tower's legs. It was massive. The brief glimpse I caught showed me something covered in dark, matted fur, walking on two legs. Its movements were unnervingly human, but no person could be that tall, that broad. I stood frozen, gripping the flashlight in one hand and my gun in the other. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It couldn't be real. I had to be imagining things. Maybe the isolation was getting to me, making me see things that weren't there. But then I heard it again. The footsteps, this time louder, heavier, like whatever it was had started climbing the tower. My heart leapt into my throat. I rushed back to the door, bolting it as tightly as I could, though I knew it wouldn't stop anything determined to get in. The sound of the thing climbing echoed through the structure, the metal beams creaking under its weight. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair as I tried to figure out what to do. The footsteps were getting closer. I backed toward the far wall, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the flashlight steady. I pointed it at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. My breathing was ragged, my chest tight with fear. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped again. I held my breath, listening. Silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. It felt like the calm before a storm, like whatever was out there was just waiting, biding its time. A minute passed, then two. I didn't move, didn't even dare to blink, afraid that if I made any noise it would come back. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Breathing. It was right outside the door. I could feel the presence of it, pressing against the walls of the cabin, filling the small space with a thick, suffocating dread. My skin prickled, my body locked in place as the thing outside shifted slightly. The door creaked, but it didn't move. It was waiting for something. For me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just sit and wait for it to break through the door. I had to do something. I moved slowly, quietly, toward the small window on the opposite side of the cabin. My only chance was to get out of here, to climb down the ladder on the far side of the tower and make a run for it. Maybe, just maybe, I could get to the trailhead and call for help. The window creaked slightly as I opened it, the cool night air rushing in. I winced at the noise, glancing over at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But it didn't. The thing outside remained still. I swung one leg over the windowsill, lowering myself carefully onto the narrow platform. The ladder was just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. I glanced down, my breath catching in my throat, when I saw the base of the tower. The figure was still there, its hulking shape barely visible in the darkness. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its eyes on me. I climbed onto the ladder, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the rungs. Every creak of the metal sent a jolt of fear through me, but I kept going, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. My feet hit the ground, and for a brief moment I felt a surge of hope. I was out, I could make it, but then I heard it. A deep, guttural growl, so low it seemed to vibrate the air around me. I turned, and there it was, standing just a few feet away, towering over me. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the faint light of my flashlight. My breath hitched in my throat as I raised the gun, my hand shaking, but before I could even think to pull the trigger, it disappeared. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest, the cold night air biting at my skin. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed on the trail, gasping for breath. By the time backup arrived, there was no trace of the creature, just me, alone in the darkness, with the memory of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. And I knew, deep down, that it was still out there, waiting. Story 13. The deer carcass was unlike anything I'd ever seen in my 20 years of hunting. Torn apart, yes, but not by any predator I recognized. As I knelt beside it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was watching me from the shadows, something that didn't belong in these woods. My name's Richard, and I've been hunting these mountains since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I know every trail, every clearing, every animal that calls this place home, or at least I thought I did. It was early November, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I'd set out before dawn, hoping to bag a buck before the season ended. The forest was quiet, shrouded in mist that clung to the trees like ghosts' fingers. I'd been tracking a promising set of deer tracks for about an hour when I caught the scent. It hit me like a physical force, the unmistakable stench of death and decay. Following my nose, I pushed through a thick stand of pines and stumbled upon a scene that stopped me in my tracks. The deer lay in a small clearing, or what was left of it. Its body had been ripped open, innards strewn about in a grotesque display. But it wasn't the gore that unsettled me. I'd seen plenty of animal kills before. It was the precision of it. The way the carcass had been systematically dismembered, almost surgically. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. The ground around the carcass was a mess of mud and blood, but as I circled the scene, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, but not like any I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boots. 5 toes splayed wide, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. But the shape... It was almost human-like, but distorted, elongated in a way that defied explanation. I crouched down to examine them more closely, my mind racing. What kind of creature could have left these tracks? A bear? No, the shape was all wrong, and bears didn't dismember their prey like this. A mountain lion. Again, the size and shape didn't fit. As I pondered, a twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush behind me. I whirled around, bringing my rifle up in one fluid motion. The forest had gone eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, expectant silence. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, and there was an intelligence behind it that made the hair on my arms stand up. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes, reflected in the dim light, about 7 feet off the ground. They blinked once, and I could have sworn I saw a flash of something like recognition in them. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Me, with my rifle pointed shakily at the shadows, and whatever it was, watching me with an unsettling intelligence. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. There was a rustle of underbrush, the sound of something large moving swiftly through the forest, and then silence once again. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for it to return. But the forest remained still, the only sound my own ragged breathing. When I finally lowered my rifle, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I looked back at the deer carcass, then at the strange footprints, and made a decision. I needed to document this. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the carcass, of the footprints, of the surrounding area. As I did, I noticed other details I'd missed in my initial shock. There were tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on some of the nearby branches, and the trees, some of them had deep claw marks gouged into their bark, far higher than any known predator in these parts could reach. As I photographed the scene, my mind raced with possibilities. Could this be evidence of something unknown to science? Some kind of undiscovered predator? Or was it something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend and campfire stories? I knew I should report this, but to whom? The game warden? The police? Would they even believe me? And if they did, what then? Would this pristine wilderness be overrun with curiosity seekers and monster hunters? In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, at least for now. I needed time to process what I'd seen, to try and make sense of it all. I made my way back to my truck in a daze, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapped twig and rustling leaf. The forest that had been my second home for decades now felt alien and threatening. That night, as I sat in my cabin reviewing the photos I'd taken, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled upon something profound, something that, if proven true, could change our understanding of the natural world. But with that excitement came a deep sense of unease. Whatever I'd encountered out there was powerful, intelligent, and had managed to remain hidden despite decades of human encroachment. Did I have the right to expose its existence? And more importantly, was I prepared for the consequences if I did? I spent the next few weeks in a state of heightened alertness, returning to the site of my encounter several times. I set up trail cameras, collected hair samples, and even made plaster casts of the footprints. But each time I visited, the area was undisturbed. It was as if the creature, whatever it was, knew it was being watched and had moved on. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found myself questioning my own experience. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had the solitude of the forest and years of campfire tales played tricks on my mind? But then I'd look at the photos, at the plaster casts sitting on my mantel, and I'd know something was out there, something that defied explanation. I've kept my secret for years now, watching from afar as cryptozoologists and Bigfoot hunters combed the forests, always coming up empty-handed. Part of me wants to come forward, to share what I know, but a larger part understands the importance of mystery, of the unknown. In a world where every inch of the planet has been mapped and catalogued, where there seem to be no frontiers left to explore, the idea that something so extraordinary could remain hidden is oddly comforting. It reminds us that nature still holds secrets, that there are still wonders out there waiting to be discovered. So I've made my peace with uncertainty. I continue to hunt these forests, but now with a different purpose. My eyes scan the shadows not for deer or elk, but for a glimpse of something miraculous. My ears strain not for the rustle of small game, but for that otherworldly growl that haunts my dreams. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the pines, I swear I can feel eyes upon me, watching, waiting, reminding me that in this vast wilderness I am not the hunter, but the hunted. To those who would seek to unravel this mystery, I offer this advice. Tread lightly, for there are some secrets the forest keeps for a reason, some mysteries that are best left unsolved. And in the end, it is not the finding that matters, but the seeking. For in that pursuit, we discover not just the wonders of the world around us, but the depths of our own capacity for wonder. As for me, I'll keep my vigil in these ancient woods, watching, waiting, and hoping that someday I might once again lock eyes with something that shouldn't exist, something that reminds me of how vast and mysterious our world truly is. Because in the end, it's not about proving the existence of monsters. It's about preserving the possibility of magic in a world that too often seems devoid of it, and that, my friends, is a hunt worth pursuing. Story 14. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the images I captured that night in the Redwood National Forest left me speechless. As a nature photographer, I've spent years chasing the perfect shot, but nothing could have prepared me for what my camera revealed in those ancient woods. My name is Dave, and this is the story of how a routine assignment turned into an encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was late September when I arrived in Northern California, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. I'd been commissioned by a prestigious wildlife magazine to capture the nocturnal life of the redwood forest. It was a dream assignment. These ancient groves were known for their diverse ecosystem and the mysterious atmosphere that settled over them after dark. I set up my base camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering redwoods that seemed to touch the sky. As I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake a feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as the natural unease that comes with being alone in the wilderness. But little did I know how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. The first few nights were productive, but uneventful. I captured stunning shots of owls in flight, deer moving silently through moonlit glades, and even a family of raccoons foraging near a stream. But it was on the fourth night that everything changed. I had set up a series of motion-activated cameras in an area known for high animal activity. It was a technique I'd used countless times before, allowing me to capture candid moments of wildlife without my presence disturbing them. As I made my rounds, checking and adjusting the cameras, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deep for a bear, too prolonged for a mountain lion. For a moment I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something large was moving through the underbrush about 50 yards away. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could make out a dark, bulky shape that seemed to move with an unsettling mix of grace and power. Instinctively, I raised my camera, thankful for the low-light lens I had invested in. Through the viewfinder, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, covered in dark fur. For a split second it turned its head in my direction, and I saw eyes reflecting the moonlight. eyes that seemed far too intelligent for any animal I knew. I pressed the shutter, my hands shaking so badly I was sure the image would be a blur, but I didn't have time to check. As soon as the creature heard the click of my camera, it vanished into the darkness with a speed that belied its size, leaving behind only the rustle of disturbed foliage and my own pounding heart. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment that massive figure would come crashing through the thin fabric. When dawn finally broke, I emerged, bleary-eyed and exhausted, to check my cameras. Most of the photos were what I expected: deer, foxes, the occasional bear. But then I came to the camera nearest to where I had seen the creature. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the images, and when I saw it, I nearly dropped the camera. There, partially obscured by a massive redwood trunk, was a figure that defied explanation. It was huge, bipedal, covered in dark fur. The image was grainy and slightly out of focus, but there was no mistaking the basic shape. It was undeniably hominid, yet clearly not human. I spent the next hour scrutinizing every pixel of that image, trying to convince myself it was a bear standing on its hind legs or some trick of light and shadow. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, both through my own eyes and through the unbiased lens of my camera. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to pack up and leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the photographer in me, the part that lived for capturing the unprecedented, insisted on staying. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I spent the next several days in a state of hyper-alertness, jumping at every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves. I set up more cameras, covering a wider area, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. But as the days passed with no further sightings, I began to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Could that photo be some elaborate hoax, a trick played by the forest itself? It was on my last night in the redwoods that I got my answer. I was making one final round, checking my cameras before packing up in the morning, when I heard it again, that deep, rumbling vocalization that had haunted my dreams for the past week. This time, I was prepared. I had my best camera in hand, the one with the most sensitive low-light sensor. I moved quietly towards the sound, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. And then I saw it. In a small clearing, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, stood a creature that shouldn't exist. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. Its body was covered in thick dark fur, and its face was disturbingly human-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an inner intelligence. For a moment, we stared at each other, two beings from different worlds, meeting in the liminal space between myth and reality. Then, moving slowly so as not to startle it, I raised my camera. The creature didn't move as I took the first shot, then another and another. It was as if it was studying me as intently as I was studying it. I don't know how long we stood there, this surreal standoff in the heart of the ancient forest. But eventually the creature turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a memory card full of impossible images. The drive back to civilization the next day was a blur. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I had seen, what I had captured. I knew I had evidence of something extraordinary, something that could change our understanding of the natural world. But I also knew the risks of coming forward with such a claim. I spent weeks poring over the images, enhancing them, analyzing every detail. I sent copies to a few trusted colleagues, experts in wildlife biology and anthropology. Their responses were a mix of excitement and skepticism. The images were compelling, they agreed, but without further evidence, it was impossible to draw any definitive conclusions. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I found myself at a crossroads. I had the story of a lifetime, photographic evidence of a creature that most dismissed as mere legend. But I also had my reputation to consider, my credibility as a nature photographer that I'd spent years building. In the end, I decided to keep the most dramatic images to myself, at least for now. I submitted a series of stunning but conventional wildlife photos to the magazine, which were well received. But I kept copies of the other photos, the impossible ones, locked away in a safe. I've been back to the redwood forest several times since that night. Each time, I tell myself it's for a new assignment, a chance to capture more of the conventional beauty of the place. But deep down, I know the truth. I'm searching for another glimpse of that impossible creature, another chance to prove to myself that what I saw was real. I haven't seen it again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest at night, I feel a presence. I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze, or see a shadow move in a way that no shadow should. And in those moments, I'm right back there, staring through my viewfinder at something that shouldn't exist. I don't know if I'll ever share those photos with the world. Maybe someday, when the time is right, when I have more evidence to back up my incredible claim. But for now, I'm content to keep this secret, to be one of the few who know that in the depths of our forests, in the shadows of our most ancient trees, there are still mysteries waiting to be uncovered. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you feel eyes upon you, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the lens captures truths that our minds aren't ready to accept. And maybe, just maybe, keep your camera ready, because you never know when you might have an encounter with the impossible. Story 15. The creature emerged from the mist like a nightmare given flesh. Massive, fur-covered and unmistakably bipedal, it loped across the far shore of the lake with an eerie grace that defied its bulk. In that moment, as I sat frozen in my small fishing boat, I realized that some legends are born in truth, and that the wilderness holds secrets far darker than I'd ever imagined. My name is Alex, and I'm about to tell you why I'll never go fishing alone again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. I'd been feeling burnt out at work, and the idea of spending a few days in solitude, just me and the great outdoors, seemed like the perfect remedy. I'd heard about this remote lake deep in the Cascade Mountains, known for its excellent fishing and stunning scenery. It was off the beaten path, requiring a good hour's hike from the nearest logging road, but that just added to its appeal. I wanted isolation, and this place promised it in spades. I arrived at the trailhead early Friday morning, my backpack loaded with camping gear and my trusty fishing rod in hand. The hike in was challenging but invigorating. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I walked, the stress of city life seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of peace and connection with nature. The lake, when I finally reached it, was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. Nestled in a valley between towering peaks, its waters were crystal clear and still as glass, reflecting the surrounding forest like a mirror. I set up camp on a small clearing near the shore, then inflated my portable fishing boat. By mid-afternoon, I was out on the water, casting my line into the depths. The first day was idyllic. I caught a few decent-sized trout, enjoyed the warm sun on my face, and reveled in the solitude. As night fell, I returned to shore, cooked my catch over a small campfire, and fell asleep to the sound of loons calling across the water. It was on the second day that things took a turn for the strange. I was out on the lake again, having woken before dawn to catch the early morning bite. A light mist hung over the water, giving the scene an almost ethereal quality. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. It was a kind of whooping call, deep and resonant, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I scanned the shoreline, trying to locate the source of the sound. At first I saw nothing but trees and mist. Then movement caught my eye. Something large was moving along the far shore, partially obscured by the low-hanging branches of the pines. I squinted, trying to make out details through the fog. That's when it stepped into a clearing, and I saw it clearly for the first time. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the way it moved that really got me. It walked on 2 legs with an ease that no bear could match, its long arms swinging at its sides. For a moment I thought I must be dreaming. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist outside of campfire stories and badly photoshopped images on conspiracy websites. But as I watched, frozen in disbelief, the creature turned its head and looked directly at me. Even from this distance I could see its eyes. They gleamed with an intelligence that was unmistakably non-animal. It regarded me for what felt like an eternity, and in that moment, I felt like a specimen under a microscope, being studied and evaluated. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the forest with a speed and silence that defied its size. I sat there in my little boat, heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, a trick of the light and mist. But I knew, deep in my bones, that what I'd witnessed was real. Shaken, I decided to cut my trip short. I rowed back to shore as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. As I packed up my camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. It wasn't until I reached my pickup truck that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the driver's side door, were 3 long, deep scratches that hadn't been there when I'd parked. They ran from the top of the door to the bottom, spaced about 8 inches apart. Whatever had made them was powerful enough to gouge through the metal like it was butter. I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, not slowing down until I hit the main highway. My mind raced the entire drive home, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. I knew what I'd seen, but I also knew how insane it would sound to anyone else. Who would believe that I'd encountered what could only be described as Bigfoot? In the days and weeks that followed, I wrestled with whether to tell anyone about my experience. I scoured the internet for similar accounts, for any shred of evidence that might corroborate what I'd seen. I found plenty of stories, some more credible than others, but nothing conclusive. Part of me wanted to go back, to try and gather evidence, but every time I considered it, I remembered those eyes, that sense of being studied by something that saw me not as a fellow creature, but as potential prey. And I'd look at the scratches on my truck door, a constant reminder that what I'd encountered was not only real, but potentially dangerous. In the end, I decided to keep my experience to myself. Who would believe me anyway? I'd be labeled a crackpot, a hoaxer, or worse. And even if someone did believe me, what then? Would I be responsible for an invasion of cryptozoologists and thrill-seekers into those pristine woods? Would I be putting that creature, and potentially others like it, at risk? No, I realized, some secrets are meant to be kept. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The wilderness is vast and ancient, and it holds wonders and terrors that we can scarcely imagine. Who are we to think we can uncover all its secrets? I still go fishing, but never alone, and never in such remote locations. I found that I prefer the company of other humans, the safety of well-traveled lakes and rivers. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that misty morning on the lake. I think about those eyes, that intelligence, and I wonder. I wonder about the things that lurk in the shadows of our world, the creatures that have managed to evade discovery despite our ever-expanding reach. And I wonder if, perhaps, they're watching us too, studying us from the fringes of our civilization, as wary of us as we would be of them. In the end, my encounter left me with more questions than answers, but it also left me with a profound sense of humility and a deep respect for the unknown. We like to think we've mapped every inch of our world, catalogued every species, but the truth is, There are still frontiers out there, still mysteries waiting to be unraveled, and maybe, just maybe, that's how it should be. Because in a world where everything is known, where there are no more wonders to discover, what's left to dream about? What's left to fuel our imagination and our sense of awe? So if you find yourself in the deep woods and you feel eyes upon you or hear a sound that doesn't quite fit, remember my story. Remember that the wilderness holds secrets, and that some of those secrets have teeth and claws. Be respectful, be cautious, and above all, be humble. Because out there, in the vast, wild places of the world, we are not the apex predator. We are merely guests, tolerated, but not always welcome. And who knows? Maybe someday, if you're lucky, or unlucky, depending on your perspective, you too might catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist, something that reminds you of how vast and mysterious our world truly is. Just be prepared for the fact that once you've seen it, you can never unsee it, and you'll never look at the wilderness quite the same way again. Story 16. People think the mountains are peaceful, a place to escape from the chaos of everyday life. But when you've been up here long enough, you start to realize the wilderness has its own rules, its own predators, and its own way of letting you know when you're not welcome. My name's Noah, and I've spent most of my life guiding expeditions into these mountains. I've seen more than most: landslides, bears, brutal weather that'll freeze you in minutes. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that trip last fall. It started like any other job. A small group of seasoned hikers hired me to take them deep into the Rockies, far from the tourist trails, where the landscape is raw, untouched, and unforgiving. They were looking for adventure, maybe a glimpse of a grizzly or some elk. What they got was something else entirely. We set up camp on the second night by a narrow river, surrounded by towering pines and jagged cliffs that seemed to claw at the sky. The place had a certain rugged beauty, the kind that makes you forget the world beyond these peaks. But as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the valley, I felt a tension in the air. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the wind, but there was something off. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of animals and rustling leaves, had fallen eerily silent. I tried to shake it off. After all, I'd been in plenty of quiet forests before. Sometimes it's just the calm before a storm, or maybe the local wildlife had moved to higher ground. But as I was setting up the tents, I noticed something strange. One of the trees near our camp, a tall, sturdy pine, had deep gashes running down its trunk. They were wide, like they'd been carved by something huge, and they looked fresh. I frowned, running my hand over the bark. Bears make scratches like these, but these were different, too wide, too deep, and the height of them, no bear could reach that high. My stomach twisted with a feeling I couldn't quite explain. "What's up?" One of the hikers, Dan, called over to me, noticing the look on my face. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a grin. "Just a bear mark. We'll be fine as long as we keep the food locked up." Dan nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't question me further, though, and I didn't offer any more details. After all, I didn't have any answers to give. Not yet. The night came on fast, cold and dark, and we huddled around the fire, telling stories and sipping on the last of the coffee. The group seemed relaxed enough, but I couldn't shake that creeping sense of unease. The silence of the forest was unnatural, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. My eyes kept darting toward the edges of the firelight, expecting to see something just beyond the glow, but there was nothing, just shadows. Around midnight, everyone turned in. The fire had burned down to embers, and I lay in my tent, listening, waiting. It wasn't long before I heard it. At first it was subtle, the soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. But then the sound became heavier, more deliberate. Footsteps, large, slow, and deliberate, circling the camp. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. I wasn't new to the mountains, and I wasn't one to spook easily. But something about those footsteps was wrong. They were too heavy to be a deer, too slow to be a bear. Whatever it was circling us. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and stepped out into the cold night air. The fire was little more than glowing coals now, casting faint light across the camp. I scanned the darkness, my breath visible in the crisp air, but I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows, but I could still hear the footsteps, closer now, louder. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw them, two massive eyes reflecting the light, staring back at me from the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. The eyes were far too high off the ground to belong to a bear or a wolf. They were watching me, unblinking, and in that moment I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't the kind of fear you get when you're facing a wild animal. It was deeper, more primal, like my body knew before my brain did that this thing, whatever it was, didn't belong in the natural world. The eyes blinked once, slowly, and then whatever it was stepped forward, just enough for me to see its silhouette. It was huge, towering over the underbrush, its broad shoulders and hunched posture making it look more like a man than any animal I'd ever seen. But no man was that big, and no man moved like this thing did. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The creature stopped at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the weak beam of light, watching me. It didn't make a sound, it didn't move, it just stood there, as if it were waiting for something. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing fit. Nothing made sense. Then, without warning, the creature turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with an unnatural speed for something so large. The forest swallowed it up in seconds, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human. It was something else, something that didn't belong in these mountains. I backed slowly toward the tents, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The other hikers were still asleep, oblivious to what had just happened. I didn't wake them. What would I say? That I'd seen something I couldn't explain, something that shouldn't exist. No, I decided to wait until morning. Maybe, I thought, I'd imagined it. Maybe the darkness had played tricks on my eyes. But when the sun came up the next day, I knew I hadn't imagined anything. The first thing I noticed was the trees. Several of them surrounding our camp had been uprooted during the night. Massive pines, their trunks thick as my waist, lay on the ground, their roots exposed and tangled like giant spider legs. It was impossible. There hadn't been any wind, no storm, nothing that could have done this. Dan was the first to notice. "What the hell?" he muttered, standing beside one of the fallen trees, his face pale. Did we sleep through a storm?" I shook my head, my mouth dry. "No storm," I said quietly. "Something else." They all looked at me then, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern. I could see the questions forming in their minds, but none of them wanted to ask. Not yet. We broke camp quickly, no one saying much. The hikers kept casting nervous glances at the trees, at the mountains that now seemed less welcoming, more ominous. The air was heavy, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. As we hiked out of the valley, I kept my eyes on the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes again, watching us. But the forest remained still, too still. The usual sounds of the wilderness, the birds, the rustling of animals in the underbrush, were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that clung to us like fog. We made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon, and as the hikers loaded their gear into the cars, I stood there, staring back at the mountains. I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't done. It had let us go this time, but it was still watching, still waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains, the wilderness itself, didn't want us there. Something was guarding them, something ancient and powerful, and we were intruders in its domain. As I drove away, the towering peaks fading in the rearview mirror, I promised myself I wouldn't go back, not there, not to those mountains. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some places are meant to be left alone. Story 17. The footprints we found that morning were impossibly large, with 5 distinct toes and deep claw marks at the end of each. As I crouched down to examine them, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Whatever had made these tracks was no ordinary animal, and I had a sinking feeling our group was no longer alone in these mountains. My name is Brian, and I've been a wilderness guide for over a decade. I've led hundreds of hiking and camping trips through some of the most remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and all manner of wildlife, but nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what happened on that ill-fated trip last autumn. It started as a routine 3-day trek through the Cascade Mountains. My group consisted of 6 clients, a mix of experienced hikers and enthusiastic novices. We set out early on a crisp Friday morning, the air thick with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. The first day went smoothly. We covered good ground, stopping occasionally to admire the breathtaking views and for me to point out interesting flora and fauna. As evening approached, we made camp in a small clearing beside a burbling stream. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the star-filled sky. It was the kind of night that reminded me why I loved this job. The trouble began on the second day. We woke to dark clouds gathering on the horizon, a sure sign of an approaching storm. I considered turning back, but we were already halfway through our planned route. Pressing on seemed the better option. By mid-afternoon, the storm hit with full force. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the trail into a muddy quagmire. The wind howled through the trees, drowning out all other sounds. Visibility dropped to near zero. "We need to find shelter," I shouted over the storm's roar. "There's a ranger station a mile ahead. We can wait it out there." We pushed on through the deluge, each step a struggle against the mud and wind. Finally, just as daylight was fading, we stumbled upon the ranger station, a solid log cabin that looked like salvation to our weary group. Once inside, we quickly set about drying off and warming up. The station was basic but well-equipped, with bunks, a wood stove, and emergency supplies. As the storm raged outside, we settled in for the night, grateful for the solid roof over our heads. It was in the early hours of the morning that I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was something else. Something large was moving around outside the cabin. I got up quietly, not wanting to alarm the others. Peering out the window, I could see nothing but darkness and the shadowy shapes of trees thrashing in the wind. But the sound continued, heavy footsteps, the cracking of branches, and then a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I woke the others, warning them to keep quiet. We huddled in the center of the cabin, listening to the sounds of something massive circling our shelter. Occasionally, we'd hear a snuffling at the door or windows, as if whatever was out there was trying to catch our scent. As dawn broke, the sounds finally ceased. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. Cautiously, we ventured outside. That's when we saw the footprints, massive impressions in the mud, easily twice the size of my own boot. They circled the entire cabin, sometimes coming right up to the windows. And there were other signs, too. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the bark of trees, and claw marks gouged deep into the wood of the cabin itself, far higher than any bear could reach. What could have made these?" one of my clients whispered, her voice shaking. I had no answer. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never seen anything like this. My mind raced through possibilities, a grizzly bear on its hind legs. But the shape was all wrong, too humanoid, and the behavior, circling us all night, but never attacking. It didn't fit any predator I knew. We needed to get out of there fast. I made the decision to cut our trip short and head back to civilization. As we hurriedly packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hike back was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush had us on edge. I kept the group close together, constantly scanning our surroundings. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement in the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. When I'd turn to look directly, there would be nothing there. It wasn't until we were about a mile from the trailhead that we heard it again. That deep, rumbling growl, closer this time. We all froze, eyes wide with fear. And then we saw it. Just for a moment, partially obscured by the trees. A massive figure, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. It was standing upright, swaying slightly as it watched us. The face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the gleam of intelligence in its eyes. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and vanished into the forest. We ran the rest of the way to the trailhead, not stopping until we reached our vehicles. The drive back to town was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. In the days and weeks that followed, I wrestled with whether to report what we'd seen. Would anyone believe us? And if they did, what then? Would these mountains be overrun with curiosity seekers and cryptozoologists? Would we be putting whatever was out there at risk? In the end, I decided to keep quiet. I gave my clients the same advice, suggesting that some experiences are best left unshared. To my knowledge, none of them have spoken publicly about what happened, but I can't forget. I still guide trips into those mountains, but now I do so with a newfound respect and caution. I'm more alert, more aware of the shadows between the trees, and sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the pines, I swear I can hear that low, rumbling growl in the distance. I've come to believe that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that have managed to remain hidden despite our best efforts to catalogue and understand every aspect of our planet. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it should be. Because in a world where every mystery has been solved, where every corner of the map has been filled in, what's left to wonder about? What's left to remind us of the raw, untamed power of nature? So if you find yourself in the deep woods and you feel eyes upon you, or hear a sound that doesn't quite fit, remember my story. Remember that the wilderness holds secrets, and that we are not always the top of the food chain. Be respectful, be cautious, and above all, be humble. Because out there in the vast, wild places of the world, there are still frontiers to be explored, still wonders to be discovered. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, or perhaps very unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of something that reminds you how little we truly know about the world around us. As for me, I'll keep leading trips into those mountains. But now, when I look out over those vast forested slopes, I see them differently, not just as a playground for human adventure, but as a realm where legends might just be born in truth. And I'll always be watching, listening, wondering, what else is out there, just beyond the edge of what we know? Story 18. I've always loved the solitude of the wilderness, but after what happened that weekend, I can't shake the feeling that sometimes we're not as alone out there as we think. What was supposed to be a peaceful family getaway turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. My name is Ryan, and this is the story of a vacation that went terrifyingly wrong. It was my wife's idea to rent the cabin. Sarah had found it online, a charming, rustic place nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains. "It'll be perfect," she said, showing me pictures of the picturesque wooden structure surrounded by towering pines. Just what we need to get away from it all. I agreed, thinking it would be a great opportunity for our kids, Emma and Jack, to experience nature away from their screens. Little did I know that getting away from it all would take on a whole new, terrifying meaning. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late October. The fall colours were in full swing, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. As we drove down the winding dirt road to the cabin, I couldn't help but notice how isolated it was. The nearest neighbour was miles away, and cell phone reception had disappeared long ago. The cabin itself was everything the pictures had promised. 2 stories of rough-hewn logs with a wide porch and a stone chimney. The kids were excited, running around exploring every nook and cranny while Sarah and I unpacked the car. That first evening was idyllic. We hiked a nearby trail, spotting deer and a family of raccoons. After dinner, we sat around the fireplace, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. As we tucked the kids into bed, I remember thinking how perfect everything was. It was sometime after midnight when I first heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from outside. At first, I dismissed it as a branch scraping against the side of the cabin in the wind. But as I lay there listening, I realized there was no wind. The scratching continued, moving around the perimeter of the cabin, as if something was circling us. I got up quietly, trying not to wake Sarah. Peering out the window, I could see nothing but darkness. The scratching had stopped, but now I heard something else, a low rumbling sound, almost like a growl but deeper, more guttural than any animal I'd ever heard. Suddenly there was a loud thump against the side of the cabin, as if something large had thrown itself against the wall. Sarah sat up with a start. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, we heard it again, thump, 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 moving around the cabin. Then came the sound of splintering wood, as if something was trying to claw its way inside. "Get the kids," I whispered urgently to Sarah. She nodded, slipping out of bed and hurrying to the children's room. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and moved cautiously towards the window. As I shone the beam outside, I caught a glimpse of something that turned my blood to ice. A massive, dark shape was moving just at the edge of the light. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and covered in what looked like shaggy fur. For a split second it turned towards the light, and I saw eyes reflecting back at me. Intelligent, almost human-like eyes, in a face that was decidedly not human. The creature let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the cabin. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale, clutching Emma and Jack close to her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to find words to describe what I'd seen. "We need to barricade the doors and windows," I managed to say. We spent the next hour in a frenzy of activity, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. The sounds outside continued, scratching, thumping, and that bone-chilling roar. The kids were terrified, huddled together on the couch, while Sarah and I tried to maintain a calm facade for their sake. As dawn approached, the noises finally began to subside. We sat in tense silence, jumping at every creak of the old cabin, until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, what I saw made my jaw drop. The clearing around the cabin was a mess. Deep gouges marked the wooden walls, some as high as the second-story windows. The porch railing was splintered in several places, and large, muddy footprints, far too big to be human, circled the entire structure. But it was what I found near the tree line that really shook me. There, half hidden in the underbrush, was a clump of coarse, dark hair, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. We didn't stay to investigate further. We packed up and left as quickly as we could, the kids still in their pajamas, leaving most of our belongings behind. The drive back to civilization was tense, filled with uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional whimper from the back seat. For weeks after, we struggled to make sense of what had happened. Sarah and I debated whether to report the incident, but we knew how it would sound. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of the police station, dismissed as city folk spooked by normal forest sounds. But I knew what I'd seen. Those eyes, that impossible size. It wasn't a bear or any other known animal. And those footprints, they'd been disturbingly human-like, yet far too large. I found myself obsessively researching local legends, poring over accounts of similar encounters in the area. I discovered stories of a creature the locals called the Adirondack Bigfoot, a massive ape-like being said to roam the deepest parts of the forest. Before our experience, I would have dismissed such tales as campfire stories meant to scare tourists. Now, I wasn't so sure. The kids had nightmares for months. Emma would wake up screaming about the monster in the woods, while Jack became afraid of the dark, insisting on sleeping with a nightlight. Sarah and I did our best to reassure them, to convince them it had all been a bad dream. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I knew we were all haunted by the same question. What really happened that night in the woods? As time passed, we tried to put the experience behind us. We stopped talking about it, filed it away as one of those inexplicable things that sometimes happen in life. But I couldn't forget. Every time I saw a news story about an unexplained sighting in the wilderness, every time I heard a strange noise in the night, I was right back there in that cabin, staring into those impossible eyes. It's been years now since that night, but its impact lingers. We never rented another remote cabin, never ventured that deep into the wilderness again. Our camping trips, when we have them, are limited to well-populated campgrounds with plenty of other people around. Sometimes I catch Sarah looking at me with a question in her eyes, as if she wants to talk about it but doesn't know how to start. The kids, now teenagers, have mostly forgotten, or at least pretend they have. But I know the truth. That night changed us all in ways we're still coming to terms with. I've never shared this story publicly before. Who would believe it? But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods near our home, I feel a presence. I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze, or see a shadow move in a way that no shadow should. And in those moments, I'm right back there, staring out that cabin window at something that shouldn't exist. I don't know what we encountered that night in the Adirondacks. I don't know if it was the creature of local legend, some undiscovered species, or something else entirely. But I do know this. There are things out there, in the dark corners of our world, that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and knowledge, nature still holds secrets we have yet to unravel. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you hear a sound you can't quite place or feel eyes upon you in the darkness, remember our story. And maybe, just maybe, think twice before dismissing those old legends. Because sometimes the monsters in the woods are all too real. Story 19. The eyes that gleamed in the darkness of the cave weren't animal, weren't human, but something in between. As I stood there, frozen in terror, I realized I'd stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Steve, and I'm about to tell you why I'll never go solo hiking again. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. I'd been feeling burnt out at work, and the idea of spending a day alone in the wilderness seemed like the perfect remedy. I chose a trail I'd hiked many times before, one that wound through the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, offering stunning views of snow-capped peaks and pristine alpine lakes. I set out early, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I walked, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. This was exactly what I needed. About 3 hours into my hike, I veered off the main trail. I'd heard rumors of a hidden waterfall nearby, and my sense of adventure got the better of me. I figured I knew these woods well enough to find my way back. That's when I saw it. a small opening in the rocky face of a cliff, partially obscured by dense undergrowth. Curiosity piqued, I pushed through the bushes to get a closer look. It was a cave entrance, narrow but definitely large enough for a person to enter. I hesitated for a moment. I hadn't planned on cave exploring, and I wasn't really equipped for it, but the allure of discovery was too strong to resist. I clicked on my flashlight and ducked into the opening. The cave widened almost immediately, opening into a large chamber. My light bounced off wet stone walls, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The air was cool and damp, with an underlying musty odor that I couldn't quite place. As I moved deeper into the cave, that odd smell grew stronger. It was musky and animal-like, but with an undertone that was almost human. A shiver ran down my spine, and for the first time, I began to question the wisdom of my impromptu exploration. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange on the cave floor. Partially buried in the soft dirt were what looked like footprints, but they were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, and distinctly humanoid in shape. 5 toes, an arched instep, but elongated and distorted in a way that was decidedly not human. My heart began to race. What could have made tracks like these? My mind cycled through possibilities. Bear, mountain lion, but nothing fit. These tracks were bipedal, made by something that walked upright. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the cave. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more resonant, with an almost linguistic quality to it. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and that's when I saw them. Eyes, 2 glowing orbs reflecting the beam of my light, set high off the ground, much higher than any known predator in these parts. They blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Time seemed to stand still as we regarded each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a consciousness that was unmistakably non-animal. Then, ever so slowly, the creature began to move towards me. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could make out a massive, fur-covered body. It walked on 2 legs with an ease that no bear could match, its long arms swinging at its sides. The head was large and somewhat conical, sitting directly on broad, powerful shoulders. As it drew closer, I could see its face more clearly. The features were an unsettling blend of ape and human, with a heavy brow ridge and a broad, flat nose. But it was the eyes that truly captivated me, deep-set and eerily human-like, filled with an expression that seemed to convey curiosity and wariness in equal measure. We were no more than 10 feet apart now. I could hear its breathing, deep and rhythmic. The musky odor I'd noticed earlier was overwhelming at this proximity. My own breath came in short, panicked gasps. Suddenly, the creature made a sound, not a growl this time, but a series of low, guttural vocalizations. Was it trying to communicate? In that moment, my fear gave way to a sense of awe. I was in the presence of something extraordinary, something that, if real, would rewrite our understanding of the natural world. Part of me wanted to reach out, to try and make contact. But a deeper, more primal part recognized the danger I was in. Slowly, carefully, I began to back away. The creature made no move to follow, but its eyes never left me. As I reached the cave entrance, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back on the main trail, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. I made it back to my car in record time, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. As I drove home, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Could it have been a bear? A hoax? Some kind of hallucination brought on by cave gases? But deep down, I knew. I knew that I'd encountered something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend and myth. I'd come face to face with a creature that most would call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. In the days and weeks that followed, I wrestled with whether to tell anyone about my experience. I scoured the internet for similar accounts, for any shred of evidence that might corroborate what I'd seen. I found plenty of stories, some more credible than others, but nothing conclusive. Part of me wanted to go back, to try and gather evidence. But every time I considered it, I remembered those eyes, that sense of being studied by something that saw me not as a threat or prey, but as an equal. And I realized that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've kept my experience to myself until now. Who would believe me anyway? I'd be labeled a crackpot, a hoaxer, or worse. And even if someone did believe me, what then? Would I be responsible for an invasion of cryptozoologists and thrill-seekers into those pristine woods? Would I be putting that creature and potentially others like it at risk? No, I realized, some secrets are meant to be kept. The wilderness is vast and ancient, and it holds wonders that we can scarcely imagine. Who are we to think we can uncover all its secrets? I still hike, but never alone, and never off the marked trails. I found that I prefer the company of other humans, the safety of well-traveled paths. But sometimes, when I'm in the woods and the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself scanning the shadows, wondering. I think about those eyes, that intelligence, and I'm filled with a sense of humility. We like to think we've mapped every inch of our world, catalogued every species. But the truth is, there are still frontiers out there, still mysteries waiting to be unraveled. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it should be. Because in a world where everything is known, where there are no more wonders to discover, what's left to dream about? What's left to fuel our imagination and our sense of awe? So if you find yourself in the deep woods and you feel eyes upon you or hear a sound that doesn't quite fit, remember my story. Remember that the wilderness holds secrets and that some of those secrets have eyes that look back. Be respectful, be cautious, and above all, be open to the possibility of wonder. Because out there, in the vast wild places of the world, there might just be things that remind us of how little we truly know, and how much there is left to discover. Story 20. As a wildlife biologist, I've always prided myself on my rational, scientific approach to the natural world. But what I encountered in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest challenged everything I thought I knew about wildlife and about myself. Sometimes the line between scientific discovery and cryptozoology is blurrier than we'd like to admit. My name is Mark, and this is the story of how my search for an elusive bear species led me to question the very foundations of my scientific beliefs. It all started with a grant to study the potential presence of a rare subspecies of black bear in the Cascade Range. Reports had been trickling in for years about unusually large bears with distinct behavioral patterns. My job was to gather concrete evidence, hair samples, scat, perhaps even photographic proof of these elusive creatures. I set up my base camp in a small clearing deep in the heart of the Cascades, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and hemlocks. The forest here was old growth, barely touched by human intervention. As I unpacked my gear, camera traps, hair snares, and high-tech tracking equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I dismissed it as the natural unease that comes with being alone in the wilderness, but little did I know how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. The first few weeks were frustrating but uneventful. I collected dozens of hair samples and scat specimens, set up camera traps in areas with reported sightings, and spent countless hours tracking game trails. But while I found plenty of evidence of normal black bears and other wildlife, there was nothing to suggest the presence of an unusual subspecies. It was during a night expedition in my 4th week that everything changed. I was using night vision goggles to observe a mineral lick where I'd seen heavy bear activity. The night was quiet, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of small nocturnal creatures. Suddenly, the forest went silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning off all ambient noise. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a primal fear that I'd never experienced before. Then I saw it. Through the green haze of my night vision goggles, a massive shape moved between the trees about 50 yards away. At first, I thought it must be a bear, but as it moved into a small clearing, I realized with a jolt that it was walking on 2 legs. My scientific mind raced to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear standing upright? But no, its gait was too smooth, too human-like. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with long arms that nearly reached its knees. Its body was covered in thick, shaggy fur. For a moment it paused, turning its head in my direction. Even through the distortion of the night vision, I could see its eyes. Intelligent, almost human-like eyes that seemed to peer right through me. I fumbled for my camera, my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate it. By the time I managed to snap a few shots, the creature had melted back into the forest, leaving me with nothing but a racing heart and a handful of blurry images. I spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the creature would return. When dawn finally broke, I hurried back to my camp to review the photos. Most of them were useless, green-tinged blurs that could have been anything. But one, a single frame, showed something that made my blood run cold. There, partially obscured by a tree trunk, was a figure that defied explanation. It was clearly bipedal, covered in fur, with proportions that matched no known animal species. I spent the next several days in a frenzy of activity. I scoured the area where I'd seen the creature, collecting hair samples, looking for footprints, setting up additional camera traps. I found a few promising leads, some unusually large tracks, tufts of coarse hair caught on tree bark, but nothing conclusive. As the days turned into weeks, doubt began to creep in. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs, distorted by the night vision and my own expectations? The photos, while intriguing, were far from definitive proof. I wrestled with whether to include my experience in my official report. As a scientist, I was trained to deal in facts, in verifiable data. What I had was little more than a campfire story, the kind of tale that would get me laughed out of academic circles. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, the impossible grace with which the creature had moved. It haunted my dreams, making me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. In the end, I decided to keep the most dramatic details to myself. My official report mentioned unusually large tracks and hair samples that warranted further study, but I left out any mention of my nighttime encounter, the blurry photos I filed away, a secret piece of evidence that I wasn't yet ready to share with the world. As I packed up my camp on the last day, I felt a mix of relief and regret. I was eager to return to civilization, to the comforting world of labs and peer reviews. But part of me wanted to stay, to keep searching for concrete proof of what I'd seen. Just as I was loading the last of my gear into my truck, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my eyes scanning the tree line. For a moment I thought I saw movement, a large, dark shape slipping between the trunks. But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure it wasn't just my imagination. The drive back to the university was a blur. My mind raced with questions, theories, and doubts. I knew I had stumbled onto something extraordinary, but I also knew the risks of coming forward with such a claim without ironclad evidence. In the months that followed, I threw myself into analyzing the data I had collected. The hair samples showed some genetic anomalies that couldn't be easily explained, and the tracks I had cast suggested a creature of unusual size and gait. But it was all circumstantial, nothing that definitively proved the existence of an unknown species. I found myself spending more and more time researching cryptozoology, a field I had previously dismissed as pseudoscience. I pored over accounts of Bigfoot sightings, comparing them to my own experience. The similarities were striking, but I still struggled to reconcile what I had seen with my scientific worldview. As news of my research spread, I began receiving emails and calls from people claiming to have had similar encounters. Most were easily dismissible, but a few gave me pause. They described details, the way the creature moved, the intelligence in its eyes, that resonated deeply with my own experience. I've been back to the Cascades several times since that first expedition. Each time, I tell myself it's for follow-up research, a chance to gather more conventional data. But deep down, I know the truth. I'm searching for another glimpse of that impossible creature, another chance to prove to myself that what I saw was real. I haven't seen it again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest at night, I feel a presence. I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze, or see a shadow move in a way that no shadow should. And in those moments, I'm right back there, staring through my night vision goggles at something that shouldn't exist. I don't know if I'll ever find the definitive proof I need to bring my discovery to the scientific community. Maybe someday, when technology advances, or when I'm lucky enough to capture clearer evidence. But for now, I'm content to keep searching, to straddle the line between established science and the unknown. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you hear a sound you can't quite place or feel eyes upon you in the darkness, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come when we're willing to look beyond the boundaries of what we think we know. And maybe, just maybe, keep your eyes open for the unexpected. Because you never know when you might have an encounter that challenges everything you believe about the natural world. Story 21. I've always found solace in solo hiking, but after what happened on that remote trail in the Rockies, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same way about being alone in the wilderness again. What began as a routine day hike turned into an encounter that would shake my understanding of the natural world to its core. My name is Lisa, and this is the story of a hike that led me face to face with the impossible. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on the trail. I'd chosen a lesser-known route in a remote part of Rocky Mountain National Park, eager to escape the crowds and immerse myself in nature. The trail was challenging, winding its way through dense forests and along steep ridges, but I was an experienced hiker and felt well prepared. As I climbed higher, the vegetation began to thin, giving way to rocky outcroppings and stunning vistas. The air was thin and crisp, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. I paused often to take photos, marveling at the raw beauty of the landscape. It was early afternoon when I reached a particularly remote section of the trail. I hadn't seen another hiker for hours, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the whisper of wind through the trees. That's when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder. But as I listened, it changed, becoming more rhythmic, almost like footsteps, heavy footsteps, much heavier than any humans should be. I froze, my senses suddenly on high alert. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, just around a bend obscured by a thick stand of trees. As I stood there, heart pounding, the footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by the crack of breaking branches. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but curiosity held me in place. I'd been hiking these mountains for years and had encountered all sorts of wildlife. Whatever this was, I told myself, it had to be something I could explain. A bear, perhaps, or an elk. But as the source of the sound came into view, I realized how wrong I was. Emerging from the trees was a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. It walked upright on 2 legs with a smooth, almost human-like gait. For a moment I thought it must be a person in some kind of costume. But as it turned its head in my direction, I saw its face, a face that was decidedly not human, yet far more intelligent and expressive than any animal I'd ever seen. Our eyes met, and in that instant, time seemed to stand still. I saw surprise in its eyes, mirroring my own shock. Then, faster than something that size should be able to move, it turned and crashed back into the underbrush. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't until I heard the creature's retreat, fading into the distance, that I snapped out of my trance. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos of the disturbed vegetation where it had stood. Then, abandoning all thoughts of continuing my hike, I turned and began to make my way back down the trail as quickly as I could. The descent was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, half expecting to see that impossible creature looming over me. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, my legs trembling from more than just the exertion of the hike. As I drove back to civilization, my mind raced. What had I seen? My rational brain tried to come up with explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs, an elaborate prank by other hikers. But I knew deep down that none of these explanations fit. The way it had moved, the intelligence in its eyes, it was something else entirely. In the days that followed, I found myself obsessively researching cryptozoology, a field I had previously dismissed as pseudoscience. I pored over accounts of Bigfoot sightings, comparing them to my own experience. The similarities were striking, but I still struggled to accept the implications. I debated whether to report what I'd seen. I knew how it would sound. Another crazy story about a monster in the woods. Who would believe me? I had no real evidence, just a few blurry photos of disturbed vegetation and my own shaken testimony. In the end, I decided to keep the encounter to myself, at least for the time being. But I couldn't let it go. I found myself returning to that trail again and again, hoping for another glimpse, another chance to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. On one of these return trips, about a month after my initial encounter, I found something that made my heart race. There, in a patch of soft earth just off the trail, was a footprint. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, with a shape that was disturbingly human-like. I took photos, made a plaster cast, and finally felt like I had something tangible to support my experience. As weeks turned into months, I became increasingly obsessed with understanding what I had seen. I reached out to wildlife biologists, anthropologists, anyone who might be able to offer some insight. Most dismissed my story outright, but a few showed interest, particularly in the footprint cast I had made. One anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, took a particular interest in my case. She had been studying reports of unknown hominids for years and found my account compelling. We spent hours discussing my encounter, analyzing the photos and the cast. While she couldn't offer any definitive answers, she encouraged me to keep investigating, to keep an open mind. The history of science is full of discoveries that were initially dismissed as impossible, she told me. Just because we can't explain something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Her words gave me the validation I needed to continue my search. I began spending more and more time in the mountains, always returning to that remote trail where I'd had my encounter. I set up trail cameras, collected hair samples, and kept detailed logs of any unusual signs I found. Most of my expeditions yielded nothing out of the ordinary, but occasionally I'd find something, an unusually large footprint, a tuft of coarse hair caught on a branch, strange vocalizations in the night that I couldn't attribute to any known animal. Each of these discoveries, however small, fueled my determination to find answers. As news of my research spread, I began receiving emails and calls from people claiming to have had similar encounters. Most were easily dismissible, but a few gave me pause. They described details, the way the creature moved, the intelligence in its eyes, that resonated deeply with my own experience. I've been back to that trail countless times now, in all seasons and weather conditions. I haven't seen the creature again, but I often feel a presence. Sometimes, when I'm setting up my cameras or collecting samples, I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze, or see a shadow move in a way that no shadow should. And in those moments, I'm right back there, staring into those impossible eyes. I don't know if I'll ever find the definitive proof I need to convince the scientific community of what I saw. Maybe someday I'll capture clear video evidence or find irrefutable physical proof. But even if I don't, I know what I saw that day on the trail. It changed me, opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that we can't yet explain. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and you hear a sound you can't quite place or feel eyes upon you in the silence, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries happen when we're willing to look beyond what we think we know. And maybe, just maybe, keep your eyes and your mind open to the unexpected, because you never know when you might have an encounter that changes everything you believe about the world around us. The wilderness still calls to me, as it always has. But now, when I lace up my hiking boots and head out on a trail, it's with a mix of excitement and trepidation, because I know that out there, in the vast expanses of our wild places, there are secrets waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, those secrets have eyes that look back at us, challenging everything we think we know about the natural world.